Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the Chiron and Aries webinar. I'm Robert Phoenix. Thank you for signing up here today and being a part of this. It's going to be an action-packed, information-dense, spiritually nutritional time that we're going to spend together today. I love talking about Chiron. It's one of my favorite aspects in astrology. And astrologically, I have Chiron in Aquarius in my third house. So it's like it's perfectly aligned for me to talk about it and to talk about it in astrological terms. And one of my experiences, well, my experience in general with astrology is to really understand where the aspects are in your chart or where the planets are in your chart so that you can really live them, right? I mean, this is, I think, one of the most essential elements to astrology because we can only really teach from the place, or we can only really share information from the place that we've experienced it. You know, all the great writers generally have experienced the things that they've written, unless, of course, they're science fiction writers, in which case it may take experiences from their past and project them into the future. But by and large, that's how writing takes place. It's been an event. The names change, the places change, but it's something that's been captured and recorded in the membrane of the cells. And astrology is the same thing. And the reason why I'm bringing this up and talking about it in these terms is because I've had some very intense chironic or chirotic experiences throughout my life. And I'll just share like a couple with you so that you can understand um, a basic, slight foundation, but a bit of a foundation of Chiron as it relates to myself and my chart. So I have Chiron and Aquarius in the third house. And one of the things that is talked about with Chiron in the third house is a learning disability or speech impediment, because we're dealing with the third house, and we're dealing with the house which represents Gemini, which is the intellect, talking, disseminating information, communication. Of course, it's siblings, and it's also the world around you. So when I was a kid, I had a terrible time with math, and to this day, I'm well short of being a polymath. Well short of being a polymath. And even with things like the rules of language, I was terrible at that stuff. But I was really, really good at information because I could pick up information from a number of different sources. I was a great reader. I learned to read really, really quickly. Like first grade, it was like I wasn't even learning to read. I was relearning to read. So that gave me a very quick edge with Chiron in the third house in Aquarius. It happened fast, right? That was the Uranian side. We're going to talk about the Uranian side, and we're going to talk about the Saturnian side of Chiron today, which is really important. So I picked things up really quickly in terms of that process, but in terms of so I was much more on the Uranian side early on with Chiron versus the Saturnian side. If you don't know what that means, don't worry about it. We'll get there. The Saturnian side was like the rules of grammar and math, and in math, of course, you've got to be very Saturnian, very very cube centric, right? With math. So I had issues and challenges with those areas. And but at the same time, I was also really good at classroom participation. Teachers loved me. So I was able to get by for a very long time on my ability to disseminate information really quickly, have a unique take, so on and so on and so on. But when it came time to really bear down and like have to get down with the rules of grammar, I was terrible at it. So fast forward, I'm in college and I'm studying ancient Egyptian language and literature, which, it's hieroglyphics. So in order to understand hieroglyphics, you have to understand basic rules of language. And again, I was adrift at sea with the basic rules of language. And I had my anthropology teacher actually take me aside and help me, and it was like I was very humble at this time. I'm in my 20s in college, learning late, right? Again, now here's the Saturnian side, the basic rules of language, so I could apply them to this class, and eventually got an A in the class. So that's kind of one side of Chiron in the third house. The other thing that was interesting for me was there was a time when I think I was in the seventh or eighth grade, and I pretended to have a speech impediment so I could get out of class and get. I pretended to stutter, and that's like a complete Chiron third house kind of experience. Fast forward later on in my life, I had a very explicit crisis with Chiron at the age of 28. We're going to get into today what the chirotic crisis is and the age roughly that it takes place at, and then the relationship to the chirotic crisis when it connects up with the Chiron return, which happens roughly around 50 years of age. Okay, so we're going to talk about that. And so I talk openly about my I talk openly about my Chiron. I have a lot of transparency. So when I was 28, I was also going through 28, 29, going through my Saturn return, and because my Chiron is at 28 Aquarius, this was the time when I was going through my chirotic crisis. And at that time, I had, for all intents and purposes, a nervous breakdown because I was getting married and I had all this pressure on me, and I was really into the woman that I was getting married to. It was just happening so fast that I couldn't assimilate everything. So I wound up basically having a kind of a private nervous breakdown. Wound up getting married. The marriage didn't work out so well because the foundation wasn't great. Okay, so that was at 28. Now, when I went through my chirotic crisis at 50, I had to revisit that. I had to revisit that meltdown period. And again, I've talked about this quite openly. I'm not ashamed or embarrassed. I was basically held for 3 days worth of observation on my Chiron or my chirotic crisis, my Chiron return. So I got to revisit that whole cycle that took place for me at 28. And it was actually a really empowering time. And in fact, it allowed me to really embrace my Chiron in my chart, because Chiron in Aquarius in the third house it's a little bit wacky, it's a little bit eccentric, it's a little bit crazy. But by that time, and I'll get into this more when we get into sort of the natal Chiron and how we how we fight against it. Okay, how we fight against natal Chiron, and I'll get into it more. But when we speak specifically about that. But I wound up reconciling it. And there's nothing like going through sort of 3 days worth of a hall of mirrors in a place where your Chiron will evoke its greatest fear. Because that's the other piece of Chiron that we have to reconcile, is the fear factor with Chiron, and having to kind of go through it all the way to the other side. We integrate it, we bring it home. Now, you don't have to wait until your Chiron return to resolve your chirotic crisis. Now, and let me put an asterisk here too. I've been doing readings since intensely since 2008, 2009, and I would say about 85 to 90% of the people that I talk to and bring up the degree of the chirotic crisis, give or take a degree either side, which would be basically a year either side. I would say 85 to 90% resonates with the chirotic crisis. Okay. Not everybody does. Not everybody does. For whatever reason, they may have a really fantastic relationship with Chiron, with another planet. Let's say they have a Chiron Jupiter trine or sextile that will ease the impact of Chiron or the chirotic crisis in one's life, or a nice relationship with Venus and Chiron. Same deal, right? I've also been seeing lately some Saturn Chiron conjunction people. That's a very interesting aspect. So anyway, with astrology, you also have to realize that not one size fits all the time. Okay, it is an art. It is a a science. It's an esoteric science. And I firmly believe that it's one of the greatest maps that we've ever created. Now, if you go back and look at the writings of Ptolemy, of course, Ptolemy is the founder of Western astrology and created the wheel as we know it, and created the astrological calendar as we know it, in terms of the Western Placidus mundane model. Okay. Now, Ptolemy said that astrology is really great at understanding and bringing a level of understanding to our experience. But this is what I found to be quite interesting. He said it's not everything. And I think this is also very important to understand, because Ptolemy was on the ball. He said, there are generational factors, there are cultural factors, there are familial factors that play into a person's life experience. And sometimes these can be clearly seen vis-a-vis the chart. And there are other times where, again, there are like blank spaces in a chart or blank spaces in a person's life as it relates to the chart. And it may not always match up. And in some cases, it has to do exactly with what Ptolemy was talking about, that there are these other influences that come into the chart and into the life. So I just wanted to put that out there so that people understand that astrology is a great tool, and it's brought a ton of meaning to my life, because this is what I do. But I've also learned to understand that we're really complex. We're complex beings. We're multidimensional. We have background in history and culture, and we actually are, believe it or not, bigger than the chart. Okay, so I just wanted to throw that out there today. And I'm not negating the chart at all. I think there's a huge amount of information and navigation that we can pull from it. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to get into Chiron and Aries. So why don't I do this? Why don't I start to share the screen here? So I'm going to get into, where are we? Let's go my entire screen. All right, let's do this. So I'm going to share screen. Let's see. Application window. Here we go. Let's do that. Here we go. Okay. So welcome to the Chiron and Aries webinar. And Chiron is going to be in Aries roughly from 2018 to 2027. We go into, Chiron goes into Aries March 19th, March 20th. It does go back into Pisces briefly, and then it marches forward. And it'll be with us till 2027. So this is an incredibly important time to be alive, to be in this domain, this third dimensional domain, and on this planet and in this country. And I know there are some of you that are in other countries around the world that are hopefully taking part in this. Excuse me. The reason why I said specifically this country is because the United States has its natal Chiron in Aries. Okay, so we're going to go through another Chiron return. This has happened before with the United States. The last time it happened at 20 degrees Aries was in 1975. And there was a very interesting event that happened in 1975, which I think really captures, in some ways, the zeitgeist of Chiron and Aries and where we're headed. Okay. So let me just give you the event. This was on January 29th. Now remember, this is it's right at that 20-degree orb. So January 29th, 1975, the Weather Underground bombed the United States Department main office in Washington, D.C. Okay? So we're going to look at that event. Actually, we're going to look at the Weather Underground because they're kind of an important story about Chiron and Aries. But clearly, there it is, right? Washington, D.C. That's ground zero. Actually, ground zero would have been Philadelphia, but we're not that far away. But, we're looking at the anima mundi, right? The axis mundi for the United States. And it's right there. And we have what? Violence, explosion, and we have the Iranian radical application of Chiron and Aries. And the reason why the Weather Underground bombed the U.S. State Department was because, number one, they wanted to overthrow the country. And number two, it grew out of their protests against the Vietnam War, which we'll also talk about. Okay, so I thought that that was pretty interesting, to be honest with you. All right, let me get back into let me get back into my Google Hang here. Where are we? Okay. All right. Okay, so let's get into a little bit of Chiron, what the essence of Chiron, the myth of Chiron. Let's get right down into the roots of Chiron. So we can have a really informed discussion about just what Chiron is and what it means, and where we go with it in terms of moving forward and discussing previous Chiron cycles and where we are. And by the way, before I get into that, okay, what's happening today? Today, March 24th, there's the march. In March, we have these kids, the Parkland kids, who are being flown from Florida to Washington, D.C. by Bob Kraft, who is the owner of the New England Patriots. Anyway, it's the march in March. And what are they marching for? They're marching for gun control. Can you say Chiron and Aries? Absolutely. Okay, so let's do this. I'm going to open another document, and we're going to look at Chiron from its mythical and to some degree historical perspective. All right, here we go. Let me just grab this. Here we go. Let me get back into share screen mode. Chiron, there he is. It's the wounded healer. Now, some of you may have known this. In fact, I think there's a lot of you out there that may have known this. Chiron is a centaur. Okay, Chiron is a centaur. And let me give you an astronomical zip code for Chiron. Chiron is part of a group of asteroids that exist between Saturn and Uranus. Okay, keep that in mind, because Saturn and Uranus are the poles of Chiron. Saturn says, this is what we do, this is how we do it. You do this, you get it done, you get rewarded. You get good grades, you go to the right school, you get the right degree, you get out into the world, you get the right job, you meet the right person, you have the right house, you have the right number of kids, and you're rewarded every step along the way. That's the Saturnian version of Chiron. In many instances, it's what your parents want you to do. Okay? It's what society, even though society is in the midst of incredible change right now, and revolution, to be honest with you. This is the traditional version of Chiron. On the other side, we have Uranus, which is radical. It's revolutionary. It wants to break the rules. It wants to take a middle finger and flip it out to the world. It wants to take the left-handed path. It is about disruption, destruction, creativity. These are the two poles that Chiron is suspended between. So Chiron was discovered in 1977, and it was discovered because they found that it actually has an orbit. All these other pieces of asteroid, which I believe are part of the Kuiper Belt, if I'm not mistaken, these pieces of asteroid None of them, and there are bigger asteroids than Chiron. But Chiron and another asteroid, which is actually named after Chiron's wife, actually has an orbit. And Chiron's orbit is irregular. So we have some Chiron cycles that are shorter and some that are longer. This is a 9-year cycle for Chiron. It's kind of long. There are much shorter cycles for Chiron too. Now, the other asteroids that are, or planetoids, that are in this sort of loose orbit around Saturn are also named after centaurs. So this is a whole group of centaurs. Excuse me, they're called the centaurs. All right, so let's talk about Chiron. Chiron. So we got some points of interest here. Who is Chiron? What is Chiron? What are their origins? Why is Chiron important? Where is Chiron? Chiron cycle. Chiron is group soul. We're going to get into all this today. Okay. So let's take a look at our friend Chiron. Chiron is the son of Kronos and Philyra. There's beautiful Philyra. There's Kronos descending. Kronos, the father of time. Kronos, a representation of Saturn. That's right. He sees this beautiful ocean nymph. She's a nymph from the ocean. Her father is Oceanus. He actually is another version of Neptune, Poseidon. So he sees this beautiful nymph and says, I really want to get with her. So I know that she just can't resist a horse. So she says, okay, Mr. Kronos, as a horse, I'll get with you. So according to the Greek myth, Chiron was sired by the Titan Kronos. He had taken the form of a horse and impregnated the nymph Philyra. So here's Kronos. Kronos is not a great guy. To be honest with you, he eats children. That's right. Besides siring Chiron, Kronos' claim to fame, or rather infamy, is devouring his offspring. He got to start in life by castrating his father. Who is it? Uranus. So here we have the conflict, the mythological conflict between Uranus or Uranos, which is what? Creativity, revolution, radical change. So Kronos says, enough with that guy. I'm going to take this scythe and I'm going to castrate him, and then I'm going to kill him. Okay, Kronos in Roman mythology is the god Saturn. Thus, we have the basis and the foundation between these two planetary bodies and the cosmic and interpersonal dynamic at play between the two mythological figures. Kronos took the form of a horse to seduce the nymph and mother of Chiron, Philyra. So who is Chiron's mommy? Look how pretty she is. All the nymphs are beautiful. Philyra was an Oceanid, a daughter of Oceanus and Tethys, the second oldest Oceanid according to Callimachus. Chiron was her son by Kronos, who chased her and consorted with her in the shape of a stallion, hence the half-human, half-equine shape of their offspring. This was said to have taken place on Mount Pelion. When she gave birth to her son, she was so disgusted by how he looked that she abandoned him at birth and implored the gods to transform her into anything other than an anthropomorphic, so she could not bear the shame of having had such a monstrous child. The gods changed her into a linden tree. Okay, so let's stop there just for a second, all right? This is an important aspect of Chiron, and one of the most important aspects that if you take anything away from this webinar today, one of the most important aspects of Chiron is this notion of shame. Okay? Notion of shame. That's what Chiron engenders. This is the wound that we need to heal, that we need to integrate, that we need to individuate. In every Chiron aspect, okay, has its version of shame. Whatever it is, that is the primary resonator, and that is the primary wound that we have to heal. And to some degree, the shame that's associated with Chiron is also connected to what? Original sin. Now, I'm not making this as a kind of, I'm not turning this into a religious discussion about Chiron, but it has that same connotation. Because when we are ashamed, what do we feel? We feel naked. We feel naked. We feel exposed. We feel vulnerable. And that was the exact same theoretical feeling that was experienced by Adam and Eve, right? When they have that moment and they realize that they're no longer in this bubble of innocence, and they look around and they're naked and it's pretty cold out and they got to figure out how they're going to get through because they've stepped into a realm of experience. And what happens at that point? Well, there's probably a pretty good chance that their first feeling may not have been, "Hey, this is great," but likely, "Oh my God, I'm ashamed. We're ashamed. How did we get here? You're naked. I'm naked." Right. So Chiron has that same kind of resonator. So archetypally, it's a pretty powerful aspect. Now, that doesn't mean everybody has to deal with shame, or some people have more issues around it than others. Let's be clear. And one of the keys to Uranus is helping overcome that. But we look at the baseline with Chiron, and that's the first emotion that is connected with Chiron. It is shame and it is rejection. Okay, so wherever Chiron is in your chart, there's a pretty good chance that you're going to have to, or maybe you already have, deal with Chiron's relationship to shame and rejection in your life. Okay, now before I move forward, we are going to have a Q&A period, and it'll come at the end of the presentation. So I know a lot of you will have questions. Hold on to them, and I'll answer as many as I can at the end of this. All right, so let's keep going forward here. So here's Chiron. Chiron was abandoned by both parents. Yeah. Where's Kronos? He's up there looking down. Oh, there's that kid. Chiron was abandoned by both parents and was raised by Apollo and Athena. Okay, so what do we have here now? We have parents that step into the breach. These are foster parents. These are mentors. And this is where the healing process of Chiron begins. There he learns skills that both gods had at their disposal. From Apollo, he learned the arts of poetry and music, medicine, archery, prophecy. From Athena, he learned about law. Chiron is also very much connected to astrology, believe it or not. He was quite different than the other centaurs who were considered beasts. This is true. Chiron is a cut above all the other centaurs who are, they're trying very desperately to deal with their animal self and their human self and not doing a very good job most of the time with either one. However, Chiron seems to have balanced both the animal side, the instinctual side, and the human side. Again, what are we talking about? The instinctual side or the elemental side or the unpredictable side is what? Uranus. And then the human side, the side that's connected to ration and reason and logic, Saturn. Okay. Chiron was refined, became mentor and father of sorts to youth such as Achilles, Theseus, Ajax, Jason, Perseus, and others. So Chiron actually became a mentor to the heroes. Right? The great heroes. Chiron is their mentor. So we have the mentorship from Apollo and Athena to Chiron mentoring Achilles, Theseus, Ajax, Jason, Perseus, and others. So when we look at Chiron, we're also looking at the ability to have this, to some degree, generational or hierarchical, what's the word I'm looking for? Almost responsibility to pass a gift on. So again, when you look at your own Chiron, ask yourself, was there anybody that you learned from? Was there anybody that you connected in terms of your Chiron? And have you been able to share that and teach that with other people? Okay. So in the end, now Chiron was immortal. In the end, he sacrificed his life for Prometheus, the mortal who stole fire from the gods. He looked at Prometheus. He was getting his liver pecked out every day. And he says, wow, I got to take care of this guy. I'm going to sacrifice myself. And here we have this notion of sacrifice that does come into Chiron, and give of myself so this person who is suffering, who is wounded, can be taken off of their cross, so to speak, or taken off of out of their healing crisis. So this is another aspect of Chiron. There's a selflessness to Chiron in terms of healing, relief, and to a large extent, redemption. Okay, so here's Chiron, the planetoid. There it is. So it was discovered October 18th, 1977, thus linking it with the sign of Libra, which adds a measure of balance to Chiron, or at the very least, finding it, because Libra isn't always balanced, am I right? Wasn't always balanced. I mean, Libra isn't always balanced. Libra is always in the search for balance, the quest for balance. So at that time, Chiron was in Taurus, which rules the body. Mercury was in Libra, Venus was in Virgo, Mars was in Cancer, Jupiter was in Cancer, Saturn in Leo. The all-important moon is in Capricorn. So if you look at all those planets, they're all in pretty personal places, right? Mars is in Cancer. That's a personal sign. Jupiter's in Cancer, personal sign. Saturn in Leo, personal sign. Venus in Virgo, personal sign. Mercury in Libra, on the cusp of being personal and transpersonal. So if I were to look at this, I would say that Chiron has a very personal impact and meaning for the rest of us. So the moon is in Capricorn, the sign ruled by Saturn. Saturn, of course, also connected to Kronos, the father of Chiron. So most of the energy and symbolism is connected to the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th house signs, and all are related to both parents, personal development, primary evolution through relationship. It's important to know. Okay, so Chiron helps us understand very, very specific elements in our lives related to Virgo and Leo and Cancer. Cancer, how we take care of ourselves emotionally. Virgo, how we take care of ourselves physically. Leo, how we take care of our heart. And Libra, how we balance people, situations, things in our life. And of course, that moon in Capricorn. That moon in Capricorn. Okay, here's Chiron's path. I'll give you an example of Chiron. So Chiron is part of the Kuiper Belt, a group of dwarf planets that are part of the outer planetary group. Chiron and its celestial neighbors live between Saturn and Uranus. Sound familiar? Chiron is the third of the centaurs, third largest of the centaurs, but has the most pronounced, if radical, orbit. The other centaur, which has a similar orbit, is Chariklo. And Chariklo is named after the mythical Chiron's wife. So that's the other planetoid. Now, it's funny, we don't talk about Chariklo in terms of astrology. If somebody wanted to pioneer that, maybe there are people out there that do that. That'd be a really, really interesting kind of field of study. Who was Chariklo? What did Chariklo represent? What are the archetypal manifestations and resonance? Both Chiron and Chariklo are rumored to have rings. How about that? It's another aspect of Chiron, which you may not have known about. Okay, so here's a Chiron through the signs, and I'll tell you what. I think you could probably get this. But this is complicated. That's a lot, right? That's a big table, a really big table. I'm gonna pass that up, but I'm gonna go to. So this is Chiron through the signs part two. You know where your Chiron is. I hope that's important. So this, I have this theory about Chiron in general, that it is a manifestation of the incarnation of group souls. Now, where that came to me, or how it came to me, is I was, of course, dealing with my own Chiron in Aquarius. And I noticed that a lot of people with Chiron in Aquarius had the same kinds of ideas, that we had the same kinds of interests, we were into the same kinds of music for the most part, the same kinds of cinema. And one could say that this is a function of culture, the time that you're raised in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's not always the case. Sometimes it is, not always the case. So I looked around and I said, well, what is my generation into? Well, we were very into the new age, super into things like when I was young, was really into psychic research, very into psychic research, psychic power, time travel. Like this was what got me excited when I was a kid. And as I got older, I found more and more people that were part of my kind of age group that were also very much into these aspects, and these cultural influences. And a lot of us migrated into, at that time, what was known as the New Age, which is completely over at this point. But it was, and in the New Age, there was really nothing new about the New Age at all. What the New Age was an amalgam of all these other disciplines and all these other ideas which had already pre-existed and were synergized and grouped together. And my sense was that the New Age, or where we were with the New Age, and especially as it related to the evolution of the personal computer, which to a large extent really came of age with the people from my Chiron group, who were early adopters in Silicon Valley and building computers. I think, if I'm not mistaken, Bill Gates has Chiron in Aquarius. Maybe Steve Jobs does, but I know Bill Gates does. So what I began to look at was that my cultural group, or the group that incarnated with Chiron and Aquarius, well, my sense was that a lot of us had been through, what was known as Atlantis, or that Hyperborean culture, which existed before recorded time, because it had all the hallmarks, the points of interest, the bullet points had all the hallmarks of being Atlantean. And I'd always been incredibly interested about Atlantis, and I found out that in my age group, I wasn't the only one. So my sense is that we were a group of souls that incarnated to kind of reanimate Atlantis, but also, because it's Chiron, talk about the vulnerability and the crisis, the Atlantean crisis. Okay, and that to me was, or is, something that we're on the cusp of. And some of you who have followed my work know for a fact that I've talked a lot about AI. I've talked a lot about transhumanism, transgenderism bleeding into transhumanism. I've talked a lot about chimeras, cloning, genetically modified foods, the 5G grid, chemtrails. These are all, kind of connected to or borderline related to aspects that went down in Atlantis. CERN, another thing I talk about. These are all very Atlantean kinds of tools and ideas, and I've actually been kind of out there talking about how these things aren't great, and how we really, really, really need to kind of rein them in before they get completely out of control. Well, it's Chiron and Aquarius. Every group has something that they're working out vis-a-vis Chiron. Okay, so just remember that as we go through this. I was just giving you my example here. So really, I start clocking this from about 1951, when Chiron was in Capricorn, and from so it was February 51 through January 55. See, that's a really short Chiron. And then after 55, he goes into Aquarius. So this is the midsection of the baby boom. Their role is to aspire to power, Capricorn, while rebelling against it. These people would make up the bulk of the student population on college campuses throughout the USA and world and form groups like SDS. There were some earlier manifestations of Chiron, people born in 49 and 50 that probably fit into that group as well. That would have been Chiron and Sagittarius. Groups like SDS to challenge presidents, chancellors, and provosts. Like Saturn and Kronos, they would use their power to castrate the patriarchy. If you look at the patriarchy, that's at that time it was Richard Nixon who was a Capricorn. This led to what was called the generation gap. It would climax in the ultimate collective castration, and that was this man, Richard Nixon, Capricorn. The push to impeach. So here we have a Uranian reaction to a Capricornian Kronos-like figure. And castrate Nixon, they did. Chiron and Capricorn slays one of its own. Richard Nixon, Capricorn. Okay. So here's Chiron's group soul part 3. So these are some of the group soul connections. So Chiron and Capricorn, it's eating the father. Eating the father and establishing Uranian and radical templates for social systems, which is what happened. I mean, if you really follow what took place after Nixon was symbolically castrated, after he was symbolically castrated, what happened was we saw this very interesting revolution around things like natural foods and yoga and all these kinds of Uranian pieces that were on the fringe, which began to get slowly integrated during the 1970s. It's a very interesting time. We also saw the rise of the human potential movement during that time. People like Werner Erhard of EST, and this is all coming out of, right? This is all coming out of what happens post-Nixon. Then we see this really interesting shift in education and the colleges, and this is when social Marxism really begins to take root. So we have the Uranian, to some degree, infestation and integration post Richard Nixon and the ritual slaying of Kronos/Capricorn. Okay, so it's eating the father. Okay, 1955 to 1961, Chiron and Aquarius team Atlantis. 1961 to 1968. You can see how Chiron is really irregular here in terms of the orbits. We have 4 years. Here we have 6 years. Here we have 7 years. Chiron and Pisces. These are the heretics and saints. People, we're right at the edge of Chiron and Pisces, which I'm going to talk about before we launch into Chiron in Aries. People who have Chiron and Pisces have been going through their Chiron return since 2011 until now. That 7-year period. So people of Chiron and Pisces, in many instances, have had to deal with a crisis of faith at some point in their life, i.e., looking at the church and saying, wow, this really doesn't fit for me. You know, I went to the church, my entire life, and I realized that between the fact that priests are basically sodomizing young boys, and the fact that they don't do enough in terms of poverty and all the real issues that quote unquote Jesus would have addressed, they have a falling out with the church, a crisis of faith. Some people with Chiron and Pisces have actually been violated by the same people that I was just talking about, referring to. It's an extreme crisis of faith. Some people with Chiron and Pisces have had to deal with things like drugs and drug addiction as it relates to a crisis in faith or crisis of faith. So what they've had to do over the course of the last 7 years is come to terms with it through their Chiron return. Very important. And I've worked with a number of people who actually went back to the church during their Chiron return. They went back and they said, I want to have another relationship with this and a different relationship with this. I've had people go through kind of their second crisis around healing as it relates to things like food or consumption of something where they're trying to fill that void. And it also becomes kind of a spiritual experience, which takes them out of it and some form of resolution. And ultimately, also, people with Chiron and Pisces begin to realize that they are not powerless, that they're not powerless, that they actually can have an impact in the world around them. But that impact is quantumly increased by some degree of faith. It's really important to understand. So from 68 to 76, we have Chiron and Aries. These are the wounded warriors, and this is what we're going to be talking about today. 68 to 76. And when we get into Chiron and Aries, I'm going to say that this is very, very specific, very important time. Extremely important time, because it's not just about, well, it's not just about like wounded warriors as it relates to, say, the Vietnam War, which we'll also talk about, or the current war, which we'll talk about, but the wounded warrior in each of us, right? Where we are wounded, that's where we need to or will need to address transiting Chiron. Transiting Chiron. Now, if you have Chiron and Aries in your chart and you're going through your Chiron return, it'll get animated. Okay? If you don't have Chiron and Aries in your chart, wherever it shows up, that is where you're going to be on the front lines. Okay? And I'm going to get into this. So hang in there. All right? 76 to 84, Chiron and Taurus. I call this group the reluctant incarnators. The reluctant incarnators. And I'm starting to read more and more for the Chiron and Taurus people. And these are people that feel like, how did I get here? How the heck did I get into a body? What is a body? I'm not from this place. And Chiron and Taurus people generally have to reconcile themselves with being in this form. And I've run across people with Chiron and Taurus that have things like body issues or eating issues, right? They could also have some, excuse me, some health issues with Chiron and Taurus. Taurus rules the throat, right? Being able to express themselves. Not always easy with Chiron and Taurus. So this, to me, is a wave of reluctant incarnators. The wounded warriors, 68 to 76, my estimation, that these are people that have gone through wars, whether it's World War II, World War I, the Civil War, the Crimean War, whatever. This is a group that has incarnated and they have the wound of war that is part of their collective soul. Same thing with Chiron and Pisces. Go back in time. These are the people that are the heretics and to some degree saints during periods where heretics were pretty easy to pick out, either due to their non-religious practices or their pagan practices, or actually displaying things like the miraculous or being persecuted for some faith or belief other than the one that was being celebrated and commercialized during that time. So you see where we're going with this? You see where we're going with this? Let's go to the next group. So this is 84 to 88. Again, a very short Chiron period. Chiron and Gemini. So these are the social schizophrenics, and these are people that are really having to deal with things like multidimensionality and multi-personality and their own version of sanity and trying to rein that all in. Where does that come from? historically? That's a really good question. I would say probably during a time where there wasn't a lot of free speech or wasn't a lot of free thoughts, that people were really locked into kind of a particular way of thinking about things. I'm going to go maybe Victorian era. And then we have 88 to 91, again, a very short Chiron period, which is Chiron in Cancer in search of home. And then 91 to 93, Chiron in Leo, finding the radical heart. 93 to 95, another very short Chiron cycle, Chiron in Libra, wounded intimacy. 95 to 2000, there's a 5-year period. Chiron in Scorpio, childhood's end. Okay? So let's talk about the chirotic crisis. Chirotic crisis usually occurs at or around the degree of Chiron in the chart. We talked about this, correct? So for instance, excuse me, if you have Chiron and Pisces in your chart at 16 degrees, the age of 16 would be the target year of the chirotic crisis. The prior year and the year after is also in the belt of the chirotic crisis because you're approaching it, then you're leaving it. So it would be the year of the degree, the year before, and the year after. That 3-year cycle, okay? And you go back and you ask people, like, well, what was going on with you when you were 10 years old? You'd be surprised. Some people have no memory of what it's like to be 10. I was like, whoa, that's a really important thing to take notice of. Okay. Other people, the chirotic crisis is just branded, like it's branded on their hearts, or it's branded in their brain. The chirotic crisis is revived and revisited when Chiron comes back around in the natal chart at the age of 50. This is called the Chiron return. Generally, takes around 50 years to get back. Okay. Now, again, there are people who you don't have to wait till your Chiron return in order to reconcile your Chiron. If you know what your chirotic crisis is or where Chiron is in your chart and you can figure it out and you can relate to it, you can work with it. It can be a creative act so that by the time your Chiron return comes around, whatever happens, if indeed something did happen during the chirotic crisis, that is actually lessened. You can move through it very quickly. I tried my best. I tried my best to heal my chirotic crisis. It still came around. So the Chiron return takes place at the age of 50, since it takes 50 years for Chiron, roughly, to return to its original place in the chart. The Chiron return will trigger the chirotic crisis, the age that the individual experienced the wounding of Chiron in their life. Chiron, like all other planetary bodies, save the sun, goes forward in retrograde. Moon doesn't go retrograde either, which means there can be 3 passes over the natal Chiron. Okay, 3 passes over the natal Chiron. Why is this happening here? Hold on. I don't want that. This is a critical period as the potential for deep integration can take place. It sets the individual on a path of not just healing, but using integration for the application of healing and service to others. Wherever you have Chiron in your chart, both by sign and house placement, this is where you must confront the social limitation of Chiron and will also provide the individual the opportunity to practice healing in the world. Sometimes this can take a literal form of healing where the person becomes a therapist, body worker, nutritionist, etc. In other cases, they will bring the integration of healing into their lives on a personal, private level. The ultimate image of the wounded healer in Western culture is this guy, Jesus Sananda Yeshua, the wounded healer. So there's a whole piece here of Chiron through the signs. Maybe I'll just keep it here for just a little period of time. I don't want to read through all of these, but I'll just keep it here for a period of time so that when you go back and watch or listen, actually watch this presentation, you'll be able to read this and maybe pick out your sign, because I don't want to go through each and every one of them. Okay. So I'll just do it slowly so that it'll be there. And you can always pause your video, correct? Go back and read some of this. which for some of you I think would be quite good. Chiron through the signs. Part 2, Leo, Virgo, Libra. And we have Scorpio, Sag. And here we go, one more, part 3. Chiron in Capricorn, Chiron in Aquarius, Chiron in Pisces. Here we go. Here's Chiron in the houses. And I'll answer some of these questions for you folks when we get into the Q&A part, okay? So I'm just going to pause that there for a little bit so that when you, again, go back and review this webinar, just pause. All you got to do is pause your video, and you can find your house. And through we have the last batch here. Must have been feeling quite gothic when I was doing this, using this this red text and this font. Interesting. Very medieval. Okay. So here's Chiron in our time. This has been Chiron in Pisces. So I want to talk a little bit about Chiron and Pisces before we launch into Chiron and Aries. So what happened during Chiron and Pisces? Well, guess what? We had gender fluidity. Do you see that? Gender fluidity. Yes, we can be all these things. We had, guess what else? We had the terrorist crisis, the rise of terrorism in kind of a big way. Chiron went into Pisces in 2011. No, that's not right. Hold on. I'm thinking of Uranus and Neptune. My bad. Chiron went into Pisces, like I said, in 2011. It did go into 2011. That's right. My apologies. I was thinking of the Fukushima event. Anyway, so we have the terror crisis, right? So what happens when we have terrorism? Well, we have perpetrators and we have victims, and we'll talk about victims. Oh, look at this. It's the refugee crisis. The refugee crisis. Where is it taking place? Water, Pisces, coming from North Africa, coming from the Middle East, reaching the shores of Europe. It is the refugee, the chirotic refugee Piscean crisis. A bit of an oil crisis with Chiron and Pisces. That's right. Why? Because we had too much of it. And by the way, Saudi Arabia looks like they're about to start pumping water in about 2030. We had too much of it. Too much can be a crisis too, besides too little. How about too little? Well, we have the water crisis, which took place in California, thanks to our friends who are busy, flying above us all the time, aerosolizing our skies. Yes, the water crisis in California. We've had a water crisis in general since Chiron and Pisces. There's a lot of toxicity in our water. You know, we've also had fracking as a pretty significant crisis with our water. Again, Chiron and Pisces. Here we go. There's the ISIS Pisces crises version. U.S. investigating ISIS use of Toyota trucks. Again, what do we have? We have these images of terror who are in the act of victimization. And I'll go on record that Christianity, which has been the symbol of the Piscean age, has also been undergoing a crisis on its own. Okay? And we've seen this happen. What happened just recently is that Apple removed Easter Took Easter right out of your calendar if you have an iPhone. There's been there's an ongoing crisis with Christianity that's going on in the world right now. And, I'm not pressing or pushing Christianity, but from an observational standpoint, it's tough sledding being a Christian these days. Chiron and Pisces. So there is this sacrificial piece that is connected with Chiron and Pisces, which clearly is a part of the Chirotic crisis or Chiron and Pisces during our time. Okay, so there's a primer on Chiron. Now, what I want to do is I want to talk about, before I move into Chiron and Aries, I want to talk about how people deal with Chiron or don't deal with Chiron in their lives. Okay, so this is in my estimation, the chirotic or the chironic dynamic. Here's what happens. We have Chiron in a particular place in our lives. Most of us will deal with Chiron in a Saturnian sense for the majority of our lives. Not everybody. I was probably more Uranian. And so I've had to go more towards Saturn as I've gotten older. And it's okay. Because I was heavily on the Uranian side. Some people are more on the Uranian side. And although I couldn't really fully claim my Uranian piece with Chiron, ultimately, until I went through my chirotic crisis and another event, which I'll tell you about. So most people hang out on the Saturnian side. And yet they will feel a sense of not being fully integrated, not being really who they could be or want to be or should be. There's always that kind of missing piece. Now, the missing piece is Uranus. That is the missing piece. Now, for most people who are on the Saturnian side, for them to jump over to Uranus is a very frightening proposition, or to look at their lives from a Uranian perspective. Because if they do, what'll happen? Well, if they go too far, their entire house of cards may come tumbling down. Okay? May just come tumbling right down. So instead of going full on Uranus, and sometimes people will kind of dip into Uranus. You know how they do that? People will dip into Uranus by doing something that is socially unacceptable. And for most people, that translates into an affair. Because it takes them out of the yoke of Saturn and out of the yoke of responsibility. That is probably the most primary kind of Uranian application. But in a lot of cases, what they'll do is they'll come running back to Saturn. Because Saturn provides them with structure, form, consistency, constancy, continuity, all those things. So it's like a part-time relationship at times with Uranus. They always wind up kind of going back. It's the nature of it. Okay? That's the most kind of prime. Sometimes it could get into other areas that are not socially acceptable, manifest in drug use. Sometimes drug use and the affair coincide together. Occasionally, it can go into other areas that are quite dark. Quite dark. And that's when we get somebody who looks for all intents and purposes, a very respectable social figure. Meanwhile, you find out that they've got 20,000 images of child porn on their computer and go hang out with a bunch of other people and do things that are clearly not socially responsible or respectable. We see that. That is a version of this, okay? So that's how some people manage it. But that's kind of an extreme version. But here's what most people do. What most people do is they'll look at that Uranus over there and they'll say, I can't do that. I may have an affair. I may feel guilty about it, whatever. but I can't go there because if I go there, it's going to irrevocably change my life to some degree. So what do? Instead, they go to the other sign. That's opposite Chiron. I've seen this again and again and again. So the opposite sign is let's take Chiron and Aries, for example. What is Aries? Aries is energy, direction, being self-directed, self-guided, volition, will, action, life force, vitality. It is the individual. That is Aries. When we have Chiron in Aries, what do we have? We have a crisis with the individual. We have a crisis with the self. So all of you out there who have Chiron and Aries, this is what you get to look forward to. Healing your self-crisis for who you are. So what is so if people don't want to go to the Uranian side, and I'll get into this when we get deeper into Chiron and Aries. I'm just giving you an example, and it's a timely example. They don't want to get into that Uranian side. Well, what do? Well, they go to the other side. They go to Libra. Well, I'm not going to deal with my crisis of self, so I'm going to have a relationship. Or I'm going to be a mediator. I'm going to be somebody that brings balance into other people's lives. I'm going to be somebody that is what's the word I'm looking for? Amenable. What did Jordan Peterson call it? I think it's amenable. But guess what happens? It is not an answer to Chiron. You can learn something. You can learn something by going to the other side. When I did it, here's what I did. I got Chiron and Aries. So it's crazy. It's outside. It's just different. Ahead of its time, sometimes genius, sometimes way out there. So where would I go if I didn't want to go over to the Saturnian side or the Uranian side for that? Whichever one. My case was mostly Saturnian. Where did I go? I went to the opposite sign, Leo. Okay. Well, guess what? My father was a Leo, so I was trying to solve my Chiron in my chart because I was different by getting Leo's approval, but at the same time being disruptive with Chiron and Aquarius. Okay, so this is where I was trying to get accepted. I was trying to go to Leo. That's where my father was. And I even remember another time when I was in high school where I was really trying to get accepted because I was like an outsider in high school. But I was a junior in high school and I was really trying to get accepted. But I was always an outsider. And you get that, once you get the vibe as an outsider as a kid, you're kind of stuck with it. Sorry, it's the way it is. But my junior year, I actually was on the junior varsity football team. And we had this homecoming pageant, and I actually was we had a homecoming queen for junior varsity football, and I actually escorted her because I was on the football team and I was trying to play quarterback. I'm trying to reconcile my Chiron by doing these Leo kinds of things. And by the time I was a senior, I said, forget it. I'm done with this. I'm just going to, be me. And that's exactly kind of what happened. It was kind of a turning point, at least for a while. But wherever your Chiron is, or has been, is, this is where, unless you can reconcile whatever sort of Chiron deficiency where you haven't been living or experiencing or integrating that Saturnian or Uranian dynamic, you'll go to the other side and you'll try to figure it out from there. And then once you figure out that that's not going to work, then guess what happens? You got to come back to your Chiron again. And there is that, in most cases, it's going to be Uranus. And there will be aspects to a chart that can trigger a chirotic crisis. like a square to Chiron. Sometimes it can be momentary. Like you can have a Mars square to Chiron, it can trigger it. And you could go through something very disruptive with a Mars square to Chiron. If you've got a Saturn square to Chiron, you're engaged in a longer period of time where your Chiron is really being tested. You have to really work through some issues. The final resolution for me with Chiron was when I went through that 3-day period of observation, which was entirely shamanic. It was incredible. It was powerful. Wouldn't change it for another experience in my life. Okay, it allowed me to face my fears. It allowed me to go through a wormhole of sorts and come out the other side. And the other piece too, which ultimately was tied into this, was the death of my father, or who was a Leo, and again, opposed not by exact degree. My father was born on the 1st of August, so he's what, about 5 degrees Leo? Is he 8, 9 degrees Leo? So it wasn't a classic opposition, but leading up to his passing, there was about a 6-month period where he was actually dying. So I spent a lot of time with him during that time. So I was resolving the opposition. I was working this out. And so finally, when he passed, it was just me and my Chiron. That's where it was. And what was really fascinating about that time was that because I have Chiron in the 3rd house and it's communication, it always felt like my father was kind of back here, in the backside of my head. And once he passed away, it was so strange. I was able to really speak because at some level, I was always trying to reconcile some version of approval, even if I was like way out there with my Chiron, and I had gotten pretty far out there. There was still that piece. It finally got integrated. And what happened was that the day my father passed, my Chiron return was exact. Neptune was also on my Chiron, transiting Neptune. It was done. It was done. So there's no cognitive dissonance anymore with my Chiron. All right. So what I want to do now. Do you understand what I'm talking about, though? Do you understand what I'm talking about? People will go to the opposite sign that Chiron's in to reconcile the fact that they are not dealing with whatever piece around Chiron that they have not dealt with. Okay, does that make sense? You can learn something, but it's not about resolving it. And again, I would say probably 85% of the population is Saturnian centric with Chiron. Okay, so let's get into some, hold on a second. Let's get into the screen share here. Hold on. Okay, let me get into screen share. And, oh man, we got too many things going. What is this? I've got into infinity. Hold on. Just want to make sure that I'm still broadcasting here. Give me 1 second. Hold on a second. Yeah. Okay. Let me get back to the Google Hang. The screen share is not happening right now. Hold on a second. Okay. I'm back again. Let me make sure that I can get the screen share going on. Hold on. One more time. Let's go application window. Try this. I don't want this. Hold on a second. I'm going to, let me go here. Hold on. I just want to go in and I want to see something here. Make sure people can still hear me.
Hi, Robert. Can you hear me?
Yeah, am I still live? I just want to make sure.
Yes, you are. If you
Great.
just want, you can leave the call and come back again.
So I'm okay though. People can hear me, right?
Yes, we hear. We just don't see the screen share.
Okay, thanks. I just wanted to clarify that.
I'll send you the link again.
Okay, so let me go back into the this piece here. Hold on one sec. Let me close this. Okay, here we go. Getting the screen share. Okay. All right, here I am, live, right?
Yeah.
Okay, let me get back to, okay, so my entire screen. Okay, here we go. Went into infinity. How do I get it out of this infinity mode, man? I'm not digging
You
this.
just have to click on the presentation.
Okay. So you are screen sharing, presentation, hi participants. My apologies, people. Let me click on, okay, got it. So let's go into.
Good, it's working.
Yeah, okay. Okay, there we go. But I've got all this infinity here. This is not good. This is the time tunnel. We are collapsing reality. Gosh, how did that happen?
Are you showing the presentation or are you looking at something else? Because I see the infinity windows.
I thought I was looking at the presentation, so apologies here, people. Let me go back into.
You have to click on your screen where the presentation is.
Right. So the presentation is up here. The problem is that it goes. I've been doing this. So we're in screen share mode. Let me just go back into screen share mode. Okay, so there's the presentation. There just happens to be too many versions of the presentation. Hold on. I'll figure this out. It was working perfectly before. Hold on. Application. Well, let's try this. There we go. How's that? Can we see that?
Yes.
All right, great. Thank you. My apologies. Where'd it go now?
I think you clicked on close.
Shit. Okay, try it again. Here we go. Here we go. Okay. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start to punch up some of these images. And we're going to go through a brief history of when Chiron went into Aries. Okay, so went into Aries back in 1969. 1969 was an incredibly pivotal year, really, really pivotal year. So one of the first things that I noticed was, so this is from January 25th in 1969. So this is right when Chiron goes into Aries. So what do we have here? This is a TV guide, and there was a series called Land of the Giants, and these are two people. Basically, the whole idea is this group of Earthlings go to another planet, and everything is enormous, so they have to deal with these giants. But what really grabbed my attention here was this headline: "Television violence. Is it really a problem?" So again, when we talk about TV and violence, what are we talking about? We're talking about guns. We're talking about guns, conflict, death, violence. And right out of the gate, and I mean right out of the gate, TV Guide is basically posing this question, which is a very chirotic question. Are we being wounded? Are our minds and our psyche being wounded by violence on television? It's the beginning of a two-part debate. And I thought that was quite interesting. One of the things that happened, again, very early on with Chiron in Aries is that Sirhan and James Earl Ray, these two, most of you know who they are. Sirhan killed Bobby Kennedy, and James Earl Ray killed Martin Luther King. Again, I'm going to put quotes around that. I don't want to get into the weeds around who they were and what other things happened in conjunction with these assassinations. I just want to focus on Chiron and Aries. And so in January of when was this? In January of 1969, basically within a span of about two to 3 weeks, they both admitted their guilt just after Chiron went into Aries. So the killings took place in 1968, but they both admitted that they were guilty. 1969, Chiron and Aries, assassination, gun death. Whether or not they were actually the people that did it, that's a whole different issue altogether. This is Golda Meir. She was elected as prime minister of Israel. Now, she actually looks like Lyndon Johnson in drag, but she became, in fact, I don't think anybody ever saw Lyndon Johnson and Golda Meir in the same room. I'm just kidding. So she was elected prime minister. And what's interesting about her is that we're dealing with Chiron and Aries. And so what we have here is we have a woman who's a leader. And at that time, unless you were a queen or a princess, it was not happening. So she's taking a role, an Aries leadership role of a fairly significant country. Okay. Now, the other thing about her that's interesting, she had Mars and Aries, and I would say about 60% of her photographs are with her smoking. And I just thought it was, again, 1969, Chiron and Aries get switched on. And what do we have here? We've got a quote unquote powerful woman, a world leader. Okay. Chiron and Aries. Here's another Chiron and Aries moment. Not long after that. Again, most of these are going to be from 1969. What do we have here? We have John Lennon and Yoko Ono, and they are having a bet-in a hotel, I believe that's Denmark, for peace. For peace. We have Chiron and Aries. What are they doing? They're going to the other side of the Chironic equation. They're going into Libra. You know, they're actually protesting the war in bed together, Libra as a couple, right? This is Chiron and Aries. So they're dealing with violence. They're dealing with the nature of violence. They're dealing with the nature of conflict. They're dealing with the nature of war, but they're doing it from a bed. And there's two of them. And of course, Lenin is a Libra. So he's going to have a Libran response to Chiron and Aries. Okay? This is quite interesting. Not many people know this, but this is Robert Rayford, who is known for a long time as Robert R. And he is considered to be the first person that died of AIDS. And this was May 15th, 1969. He was from St. Louis. And the reason I brought this up is because AIDS is connected to the blood. And we have a healing crisis of the blood. Aries is the blood. It is transmitted. So this is really fascinating. This is a really, really interesting kind of, not just an astrological correspondence, because we're dealing with Aries and blood and a blood-borne, blood transmissible disease, but one that will not technically rear its head again until the 1980s. So it's anomalous, it's mysterious, but it is generally not, it's not generally, because most people don't know this, but it is uniquely known that this is the first victim of what we would later call AIDS, and it's with Chiron and Aries. Robert Rayford. Okay? May 15th. Whoops. We don't want that. That's my email. You don't want that. You want this. Okay, let's go here. Let me just close this.
Hi, Robert. We can't see the files when you open them.
Oh, okay. My bad. Let me go back. It's okay. Are we there now? Can you see them?
No, it just shows the files that are unopened.
Oh, okay. Okay, let me see. Well, okay, hold on. Okay, here we go.
Ah.
My apologies. I just have to go in every time. So this is Jon Voight, and he won the Oscar for Midnight Cowboy. And the reason now Midnight Cowboy actually premieres in 1969. It will win the Oscar in 1970. And the reason why I thought this was significant, you'll see a theme here. So Jon Voight, his character is sort of this, in some ways, typical male. And he's this typical male cowboy. He's trying to be an alpha. He's from Texas. Okay, so he's from Texas, and his character moves to New York City because he sees himself as being a quote unquote stud, and he wants to essentially have rich female clients that he can, prostitute himself out as. Okay, so this is an interesting kind of turn in cinema, and what we'll see over the course of Chiron and Aries is the birth of what we call the anti-hero as well, which is very fascinating. So we're dealing with Aries, which is typically resonant with the hero. Jon Voight, in this character, he's in some ways he's an anti-hero. But one of the things that he has to do is, number one, he has to prostitute himself out to a man, not just a woman or women, but a man. So he's got to have this kind of Chiron and Aries crisis about what his sexuality is, what his energy is, what his identity is. And then he becomes friends with the Dustin Hoffman character, somebody by the name of, his name is Ratso Rizzo. And he actually takes Ratso under his wing. And Ratso is the kind of the anti Jon Voight character in this movie. And he winds up actually caring for him and healing for all intents and purposes, which is kind of a despicable character, which is what Dustin Hoffman's character becomes. And he winds up trying to take him out of New York and get him to a better place. And Hoffman's character is quite sick and dies on him. So in one movie, we have this very interesting personification of Chiron and Aries. We have the prototypical male who believes he's an alpha male. He believes he's sexually endowed and powerful and can use those traits and characteristics to go to New York City, become a hustler, score, make lots of money, and reaffirm his primary sexual identity. But what happens is he has to cross a line. He has to prostitute himself out to other men because they will pay. Women won't pay. He's not in that category. And then he has this unusual relationship with Dustin Hoffman, who is the anti Jon Voight character, whose name is Joe. I think his name is Joe Buck in this movie, and he's the anti Joe Buck. He's limping, he's lame, and he winds up caring for this despicable character. So he's healing an aspect of his male persona. Okay, thought it was really interesting. We'll see more of this as we go through this. Let me do another one here. Screen share. 1 sec. Okay, this is a poster for the Weather Underground. And again, this is all happening in 1969. when Chiron goes into, this is when the weather underground really kicks into gear. Now you may recognize this guy over here on this side. That's William Ayers. The woman to the far right is Bernadine Dorn, who will become his future wife. Bill Ayers wound up becoming a very influential person in politics, and clearly was a mentor for Barack Obama. For all intents and purposes, wrote Obama's first book, Dreams of My Father, and is widely considered the founder of Common Core. Now, what's interesting about the Weather Underground, they really kick into gear in 1969, and they are anti-war protesters. So we're dealing with what? Chiron and Aries. Chiron and Aries. And they not only are anti-war protesters, but they essentially storm the anti-war movement, take it over, and their mantra is by any means necessary. They will use violence. Clearly, they are in the midst of this Saturnian, Uranian friction between the two archetypal forces of Chiron. Saturn represents the government doing war, the business of war, Aries. And by the way, these kids in the Weather Underground all came from really respectable families. They came from Saturnian families. They did not come from the families of, well, they could be both respectable and communistic at the same time. Bill Ayers' father was. But they went to the Uranian side. They went to the Uranian side and they took on the government. And that was the event that I was referring to when it was 1975. So they were engaged for a while. And they had the government building, not just the government building. They had other buildings that they had blown up or had set explosions to go off. One was, I believe, a police station in San Francisco. So they were responsible for not only the death of other people, but also the death of people inside their own group, because they were working on bombs. And one of them went off. And what did we just have in Austin last week? We had bombs going off in Austin. Now, remember, when I did the webinar on Saturn and Capricorn, I said that you can always get a sense as to where things are headed by the final degrees of a sign. So here we are, 28 degrees Pisces, right? 28 degrees Pisces, about to go into Aries, Chiron and Aries. What did we see? Well, we saw bombs going off. We saw them going off in Austin. What happened in Parkland? Well, we have this event, the school shooting, whatever happened in Parkland. That happened. Final degrees, Chiron and Pisces. So we can kind of get an understanding and a vector as to where this is going, right? So here we go. Weather Underground, radical. They are right in that frisson between Uranus and Aries. They're not going out to the other side of the chirotic duality, are they? They're not going into Libra. They're not saying, "Hey, let's sit down and talk about it and make peace." No, they're radical. They're terrorists. So that they really came on the scene in 1969, just when Chiron is entering into Aries. Okay. So let me go into another file here. Oops. All right. Give me one sec while I load the screen share back up. Okay, what is this? This is Stonewall. Again, Stonewall happens in 1969, not long after Chiron goes into Aries. And what do we have? We have the gay community. And at that time, by the way, a lot of people don't understand this. Being gay in America at that time was It wasn't easy. It was not easy. And in most cases, it was actually against the law. Okay. It was against the law to have a sexual relationship with somebody that was the same sex. So this took place in 1969. This is, I believe it's the summer of 1969. What do we have here? We have men, right? Again, they're men, but what are they doing? They're rebelling. They're rebelling. They're taking the Uranian path, rebelling against Saturn, which in this instance is the laws of New York State, New York City, the police of New York City, and they actually had a riot, a full-scale riot, and they took on the cops. So this is kind of a landmark time in people essentially fighting for their right to do what they want with their bodies, to hang out with whoever they want to hang out with. It's a pretty significant moment in American history, and it really starts in many ways the revolution. There's a significant sexual revolution that's going to be going on throughout Chiron and Aries, and this is one manifestation of it. Okay, so this is Stonewall, takes place during Chiron and Aries. All right, let's do another piece here. And let me punch that up. Let me get back into screen share. In the summer of 1969, the first wave of troops from Vietnam were coming home. Look at that. So check this out. Look at that guy's. Look at his helmet. Big Buddha. Big Buddha. And over here to his right, what do you have? That's an obelisk. That's a Freemasonic obelisk. And believe it or not, that's in Vietnam. Look how young this guy is over here, Bushwhacker. Look how young he is. So this is the first wave of soldiers that start to matriculate back to the United States. And what happens with the American soldier during this time is we have really the first wave of truly wounded warriors. And not only they wounded, but unfortunately, the American public, and here's where we get into the shame of Chiron. The American public cast a wide net of shame on these men, and they were primarily men. Back then, they had wax and waves, and they were mostly nurses and support. So it was the men who were out fighting. So these guys come home, they're wounded. They're literally wounded from the war, figuratively wounded, psychologically, spiritually wounded. And they have to deal with the shame that they fought in a war that most people did not want them to be fighting in. Clearly, a Chiron in Aries extended moment in time. And it's, I think, one of the greatest travesties that the American public perpetrated upon itself. And I understand the time and the tenor and all that stuff, but these guys were meant to feel worthless and worse than worthless, killers. And in many cases, they didn't have a choice. You know what's fascinating? This is what's really fascinating. You look at John Bolton, he was just named to be the Secretary Secretary of State, right? Is that what he? No, yeah, Secretary of State, Madison Secretary of Defense, and John Bolton was a draft dodger. He's a war hawk, but he's a draft dodger. And Trump, by the way, was also a draft dodger. Claims he had a problem with his foot. So here we have these draft dodgers who are in office presiding over another Chiron and Aries moment in time. Anyway, I just wanted to show you that image. This is when the first wave of troops, the wounded warriors, begin to come home. Anybody recognize that image? It's Buzz Aldrin. And that is the Apollo landing. That's in July of 1969. And the reason why this doesn't have a lot to do with Chiron per se, except the fact that the moon landings were not what they were really shown to be. Let's be clear about that. But what I thought was interesting about this was that the spacecraft that took the first group of men to the moon, Collins, Aldrich, and Neil Armstrong, was Apollo, and Apollo being the teacher of Chiron. And again, when these guys came back, they were celebrated as heroes. But as time has gone on, not so celebrated. In fact, Buzz Aldrin has actually taken a lot of heat and scorn for what people believe was a completely and utterly faked moon landing. But again, this was taking place, Chiron and Aries. And that was a time when America needed heroes, right? We needed heroes during the 60s because this was the birth of the anti-hero. Remember that. So it was probably a nice little plan and nice little scheme to manifest some heroes for the American public. Okay, so this is really fascinating for me in terms of time. This is one of those timepieces that is interesting and kind of mind-blowing. So in 1969, there was the Chappaquiddick scandal. And this is when Ted Kennedy was with a woman by the name of Mary Jo Kopechne. And he was having an affair with her, okay? Ted Kennedy was having an affair with her. And so what happened is that they were driving across the Chappaquiddick River, and his car went off into the river, and he got out, but Mary Jo Kopechne died. And it was a huge scandal. It's another one of the Kennedy scandals. And I don't want to go into it too deeply, but there's a pretty intense backstory around it. Now, here's what's fascinating. Right now, they have a movie that's airing called Chappaquiddick. So here we are. We're getting ready to go into Chiron and Aries, getting ready to go right into Chiron and Aries. And they're making a movie about Chappaquiddick, which took place during the initial phases of Chiron and Aries. And I thought, this is fascinating. This is utterly fascinating. We're literally revisiting the scene of the crime as Chiron goes into aspect here. I think that's fascinating, myself. That's an astrosync. That's what we call that, an astrosync. Okay, let's get into another image here. You guys will like this one. You get a kick out of this one. Give me 1 second. We all know who that is, right? The Brady Bunch. So why am I showing the Brady Bunch? Well, there's two reasons. One, I'm showing the Brady Bunch because the Brady Bunch was a show that was going to appeal to what? Families that were divorced, right? These are two either widowed or divorced parents, however they got there. They're families that are brought together. Now, 1969, we're about to go into Pluto and Libra, which will take place, around 1971, right? And that's when the divorce rate starts to go through the roof. And what had happened was through Vatican II, the divorce laws for the Catholic Church were essentially almost wiped out. Like if you were Catholic prior to 1966, getting a divorce was very difficult. But after 1966, it got a lot easier. And then states went through no fault divorces. But what's also interesting about this is Robert Reed, who plays Mr. Brady, the father, right? So he's playing this upstanding father figure. Everybody loved Mike Brady, right? Is that what his name was? Mike Brady. Everybody loved Mike Brady. Calm, reassuring, patient dad. Well, the inside baseball on Robert Reed is he was gay. He was gay. He was like a TV version of Rock Hudson, which Hollywood likes to do, and portray these masculine figures or these father type figures when underneath they're really just playing a role. That's all Robert Reed was doing. He was playing a role. And again, you can see this theme with Chiron and Aries. We have what? John Voight as Joe Bach. We have the Stonewall riots, and we have a leading man playing somebody who's a straight dad who isn't straight at all. Chiron and Aries. This is men dealing with either sexuality directly or indirectly, hidden or cloaked. Okay? Thought you'd enjoy that. We got a few more of these. This one is a bit more difficult to swallow. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but it's also, again, very important to understand in terms of Chiron and Aries. Again, this is all 1969. 1969 was an incredibly pivotal year. What do we have here? This is the My Lai Massacre. The My Lai Massacre. So we're talking November 1969. This is when Lieutenant William Calley and a group of soldiers went into a village in Vietnam, North Vietnam, and killed 150 civilians. William Calley gets court-martialed. And what do we have here? We have Chiron and Aries. We're being brought back the horror of the imagery of war and the brutality of war. And it's not just the horror of the imagery, it's the brutality of war. You know, and people are seeing this and they're saying, my God, what are we doing over here? And this, by the way, is what's fueling people like the Weather Underground and wanting to blow up government buildings. This was another little interesting piece that took place with Chiron and Aries. In some ways, it's kind of whimsical, but it's also very, you know, it's also fascinating in terms of its cultural implications. In 1969, a group of Native Americans took over Alcatraz. They reclaimed Alcatraz as part of their own. And what do we associate with Native Americans? Well, we associate, generally speaking, warriors. It's a warrior culture. Am I right? I mean, they fought amongst each other. They fought the Wasatch, they fought the English, they fought the French. Yeah, they were territorial. They were territorial with themselves, amongst themselves. You know, so this is a warrior-based culture. So what are we talking about? Talking about Chiron and Aries. So here we have an indigenous culture that has a history of being warriors. And what do? They do something completely Uranian, and they claim Alcatraz. They claim Alcatraz as their own. By the way, this is where a very young John Trudell comes onto the scene and becomes a very charismatic voice of the Native American indigenous culture. I just had to throw this in there as a Chiron and Aries kind of moment in time. And it's prison, right? You're taking over a prison. A prison. This is where people get incarcerated. It's Piscean, yes, because it's surrounded by water, but also Saturn. You have guards in a prison. You have a hierarchy that watches over the prison. So they were working Uranus here. They were doing a fine job of accessing Uranus when they took over Alcatraz. I remember when that happened as a kid. I thought that was kind of cool. So a few more here. We're going to get into the present time. Here's what's really fascinating. This is I had to bring this up. This was interesting. Again, it's one of those astro syncs that I just love. Check this out. Okay, so the image you're seeing here is the Super Bowl winner in 1970. It's the Kansas City Chiefs. The Kansas City Chiefs. What did we just see with the Native Americans that took over Alcatraz? Well, they may not have ultimately won and become the residents of Alcatraz, but a few months after that, the Kansas City Chiefs, again, we're dealing with Native American imagery, indigenous culture. They won the Super Bowl. They won the Super Bowl a few months later. Who did they defeat? The Minnesota Vikings, right? Which probably represents sort of the most, kind of white northern manifestation of a team mascot over any other team, except for maybe the Celtics. So I thought this was fascinating. In this wave of Chiron and Aries, that we have the Native Americans storming Alcatraz, and then a few months later, the Chiefs actually beating the Minnesota Vikings. I thought that was pretty fascinating. I love that stuff, though. Okay, we just have a few more, but they're interesting. Trust me. Okay, so this is a fascinating image that takes place here. Again, it has to do with guns, it has to do with violence, it has to do with blood, and it has to do with ritual. All again, Chiron and Aries. This is the 6th of December, and it is a scene from a concert that the Rolling Stones did called Altamont. Altamont was supposed to be the West Coast answer to Woodstock. It was a concert with the Rolling Stones, the Grateful Dead, Ike and Tina Turner, and the Jefferson Airplane. And it was an absolute disaster. Now you can see here that the Hells Angels are present. The Rolling Stones hired the Hells Angels to do crowd control. Meredith Hunter was a young man who was killed during this concert. And there's a song called Gimme Shelter that the Stones did. There's a whole documentary called Gimme Shelter. You can watch this documentary, all about Altamont. And here we have, again, death, gun violence, Chiron and Aries. It is the shadow, by the way. It is the shadow of Woodstock. Now, this is interesting. This gets into interesting esoteric and symbolic territory. If Woodstock was Aquarian and Uranian, gathering of the tribes, peaceful, could Altamont be the dark side of Saturn? Question mark. What's also interesting is just before Altamont is staged, the Stones release Let It Bleed, which is their answer to Let It Be, which is the Beatles' last record. Let It Be, Let It Bleed. The Stones and the Beatles always played off one another. They're part of that Gemini duality. But we have Let It Bleed. We have the murder of Meredith Hunter. We have Altamont. Again, Chiron and Aries, gun violence. Also ritual here. We're dealing with blood ritual. It's a blood ritual. Who was a cameraman on the shoot of the movie Gimme Shelter? George Lucas. George Lucas was here actually filming this concert. Fascinating movie. I highly recommend watching it. Got just a couple more here, and then we're going to get into present time. And this is where we get into feminism, because feminism was really kicked into high gear during Chiron and Aries last time we were there. This is the book that does it, published in 1969, Sexual Politics, Kate Millett. And here she is. She's the face of women's liberation, the politics of sex. Sexual Politics is generally regarded as the first classical and scholarly work on feminism. Okay, so this is the birth of feminism taking place during Chiron and Aries. And again, we're dealing with the identity we're dealing with will, we're dealing with male power, and we're dealing with the Iranian version of male power, the other side of it, which is women. Okay? Well, the other side is Libra Venus, but the different application of it is a radicalized version of it. Okay. So this takes place in 1969. And not long after that, in 1972, we have another interesting development in terms of the women's movement, again during Chiron and Aries. And that is the first issue of Ms. Magazine. And the woman on the right is Gloria Steinem, who is the publisher of Ms. And she goes on to become one of the more famous faces of feminism. And what's interesting about Steinem, first of all, she was, and this is part of the public record, by the way, she worked for the CIA. So to that extent, she's nominally interesting, right? She's got roots in the CIA. A lot of people do, by the way. A lot of cultural icons are connected to the CIA. She's one of them. But what's fascinating about Gloria Steinem, she was a Playboy bunny. And if you look at people who've been associated with feminism, by and large, based on society's cultural standards around what beauty is, they do not generally qualify. They're generally not attractive in terms of quote unquote society's standards. Gloria Steinem is. She is the face that sells feminism to middle America. She's a face that is pretty, attractive. Oh, I can relate to her. She's attractive. She has qualities that I can aspire towards, at least on a physical standpoint. Oh, and she's smart, and she's a feminist. So make no mistake, Gloria Steinem was uniquely situated and positioned to become the face of feminism in the 70s to attract the widest number of women possible. Here's the first image of Ms. Magazine. It's fascinating. It's the woman as destroyer, right? You know, this is woman as destroyer. This is woman as destroyer. This is Kali. Woman is doing the Kali dance, right? Very interesting. But she's got all her different manifestations, which are everyday appliances, time, cleaning the house, making breakfast, the typewriter, working, driving, cleaning. She's got a baby right here inside of her, and yet she's an image of Kali, the destroyer. Interesting stuff. And that happens during Chiron. This is 1972. Okay. So I want to just do a couple of other things here. This is a generational image of Chiron. These are people that are born during Chiron and Aries. And they're all pretty much going through their Chiron return right now. Okay, here we go. So just a quick rundown. We've got Winona Ryder up on, I'm sorry, not Uma Thurman, top left-hand corner. Right next to her, Naomi Wolf, who is what, a third wave feminist. To her right, Phoenix, River Phoenix. To his right, Andre Agassi. To his right, DMX. Below DMX, we have Gwyneth Paltrow. Below Gwyneth Paltrow, Larry Page of Google. To his right, Shaquille O'Neal. Above Shaquille O'Neal, Nikki Haley, who's the ambassador to the UN. To her left, that's Sarah Silverman. To her right, that's Matt Damon. And to his right, Melania Trump, going through her Chiron return. How about that? Below her, Queen Latifah. And to her right, we have Leah Remini. Now, some of these women are really fascinating, I have to say. I mean, these are strong women. Like, you know, Melania Trump takes a lot of flack, but this is, you know, she speaks 5 languages. And I'm not sure her marriage is going to last to President Tweet. But I actually think she's a pretty strong woman, to be honest. She's got like 5 planets in Taurus. Very grounded person. Leah Remini is another strong woman. She left Scientology. And she went on a crusade against Scientology. Now, I'm not a big fan of Sarah Silverman, But again, another strong personality. She doesn't, she doesn't give a shit. Gwyneth Paltrow, another strong one. She's got her own issues with some of the stuff that's going on with her website, and she's under attack. Actually, she's an anti-vaxxer. She's all about naturopathy, and she's under attack. Nikki Haley, I'm not a fan of, but again, another strong woman. You get into Andre Agassi and River Phoenix, a little bit of metrosexuality. Matt Damon, a sensitive guy. He's a sensitive man, isn't he? Anyway, I just wanted to give you some historical context with some of the people that have Chiron and Aries in their chart, and they're all about to go through their Chiron return. I'm going to leave that up for a bit. And what I want to talk about now is where we are culturally with Chiron and Aries and what we have to look forward to over the course of the next 9 years. Clearly, right out of the gate, we're dealing with guns. We're dealing with guns. We're dealing with the issue around guns. Who can have them? Who can't have them? Gun control. It's right out there. It's right out front. It's a Chiron and Aries issue. Chiron and Aries issue. And what we've seen is that there's no negotiating. They're not going to Libra on the other side of this. No, they're not going to Libra. Where are they going? They're going to Uranus. Radical action needs to be taken. Okay? Radical action needs to be taken. Now, look, I have my thoughts, I have my opinions about what happened in Parkland. I have my thoughts and opinions about the forces behind Parkland, which, in my estimation, are clearly astroturfed. Clearly astroturfed. But what cannot be denied from an astrological perspective is that we are dealing with Chiron and Aries, and this is part of it. And it will be part of it, okay? So we've already seen radical steps and actions that have been taken by what? By advertisers, by stores like Dick's, who won't sell guns, to people between the ages of 18 and 21. We've seen sponsorships being pulled, advertising being pulled, and it's getting so radical that we're actually seeing like mentions around the word gun going away. Keep your eye on this, because what's happened is they've tied the Second Amendment to the First Amendment. It's interesting. It's interesting. So we're dealing with this, right? We're dealing with this. We're also coming out of this Chiron and Pisces period and phase of time. And what have we seen with Chiron and Pisces? We've seen the rise of suffering, the martyr, and victimization. Now, I've gotten into some hot water because I've said that through Chiron and Pisces, we have celebrated the victim. We've celebrated the victim. Look at all the, the hashtag Boston Strong or hashtag, Orlando Strong, whatever it is. We celebrate the victim. We do not have not celebrated the hero, or we have not celebrated the independent agent who acts or who takes responsibility during Chiron and Pisces. And in fact, that was actually dismissed, or it's not a solution. It's not an option. Well, one of the things we saw during Chiron and Pisces was the rise of some form of social legislation around bullying. Okay. What they didn't do during this kind of run through Chiron and Pisces, where there's either social legislation or some kind of social programming around, they didn't say, hey, look, go learn how to take care of yourself. Learn how to stand up for yourself. Why don't you take some martial arts? Why don't you learn how to defend yourself? Why don't you learn how to stand in the face of a bully and say no? And to take, because look, I may sound like Clint Eastwood in that film where he says, "Get off my lawn." But when I was a kid, we had to deal with this. We had to deal with this. We had to deal with the fact that there were bullies in the world. And this is how things got sorted out. Now, was it the best way? I'm not sure. But I'm also not sure that insulating the experience is the best way either. Because what happens is if we take bullies on, we develop something called psychic immunity. We have a psychic immunity towards being bullied. And once you address that, there's a very good chance that you're not going to be bullied again. If you are, probably didn't do it right the first time. So what we didn't do is we didn't say, hey, here are tools. Here are tools to help you overcome a bully. And instead, what we said is, hey, go find somebody else. Go find somebody else who will take care of the bully. Go find an authority figure. We ceded our authority during this time with Chiron and Aries and this whole culture of venerating and celebrating the victim. And here comes Chiron and Pisces. Chiron and Aries, hopefully, is not about that. Hopefully, with Chiron and Aries, what we are going to do is we are going to readdress what it means to be accountable for ourselves. That's Aries. Aries is accountability. I am accountable for who I am. I am accountable for my thoughts. I am accountable for my feelings. I am accountable for my actions. I'm accountable for my reactions. Nobody else is responsible for it. I am the one who needs to take care of this. I'm the one. So in Chiron and Aries, are we going to see a shift away from victimization towards self-actualization? Is this when we are going to address it? Are we going to move into it? If we are, we're going to have to deal with the forces of Uranus and Saturn. Correct? Saturn says, no. Saturn becomes the bureaucracy. No, you're not going to do it. We're going to take care of it for you. We're going to take care of it for you. We'll put vets in the school with rifles. Right? This is what we're going to take care of it. We'll take care of it. We'll put metal detectors and scanners in the schools. We'll take care of it. You're not going to take care of it. We'll take care of it. If there is a radical approach and the individual says, look, we're going to take care of this. We're going to stand up for ourselves. We're going to make sure that we're taking accountability, responsibility for our lives, whatever that means, whatever it means, whether it's you want to start your own community, your own currency, your own company, whatever it is, right? We're talking the individual, the Uranian capacity for the individual to do something radical and different and take responsibility for who they are in a climate where we delegated that responsibility. We outsourced it. It's going to be a very, very interesting time. And on the flip side of that, we have Libra, which is negotiating between the two. So one of the things that Heather Eland and I talked about is what's going to happen with women and men during Chiron and Aries. And for women, this is a really interesting kind of dilemma. A lot of women with Chiron and Aries, and women in general, let's talk about women that are born with Chiron and Aries. They have a very powerful moment in time where there is a reclamation of personal responsibility, autonomy, authority, and power. Because what I've seen in my work with women with Chiron and Aries is that women who have Chiron and Aries from a very early age, they're very competent, extremely competent. They have a lot of life force. They have real self-direction. And what happened during that period is that even though we were going through a major cultural change during the late 60s and into the mid 70s, by and large, there were still very kind of parochial roles traditional roles for men and women, boys and girls. So the girls were more apt to be classified as tomboys or having too much energy or having too much spirits. So it's like, hey, you're too bossy, you're too mouthy, you're too fill in the blank, reel it in. And it could be parental, it could be the father, it could be the mother, it could be the school, whatever it is. The message for young girls born with Chiron and Aries is put it back in the box, reel it in. It's too much. So what happens to those girls? Well, they say, okay, I'm going to go to Libra. I'm going to be a helper. I'm going to be somebody who's going to be a peacemaker. I'll sit back. You can run the show. I'll join in. I'll add my 2 cents. I'll collaborate. And how well does that work out for those women? I'm sure there's some of you in the chat room right now. How well has it worked out for you? I'd say maybe a mixed bag at best. And for some of you, not well at all. Because guess what? Here comes Chiron and Aries. You're going to have to face that. You have to face it. And in many cases, women with Chiron and Aries have sublimated and stuffed their energy for what? Relationship and marriage. That's what they've done. So now they got to come back into this aspect of who they are, being directed, guided, self-directed, guided, individuated, living their lives and living their lives unabashedly. It's like, I am who I am. I have energy. I've got ideas. I know what to do. And now I'm going to reconcile this, even at this stage of time in my life. Now, for all women, you're going to be going through Chiron and Aries at some point in your chart, right? You may not have Chiron and Aries natally, but it's going to go through your chart, guarantee you. And that's where you're going to have to develop self-direction, self-guidance, self-sustenance, and will. You're going to have to face your fears with Chiron and Aries and whatever house it goes through. We'll get into some of that. What about men? What about men with Chiron and Aries? Well, I'll tell you what happened to men during the women's revolution, right? The feminist revolution during 69 to the 70s and just beyond that, like the late 70s. You know what men did? Men said, well, if I want to have a mate or I want to have a sexual encounter, whether it's a series of sexual encounters or a brief sexual encounter, men played to this whole idea of being sensitive because that's what was being asked of them during this first wave of feminism. We need men to theoretically be more like us. We need them to listen. We need them to be empathic. We need them to be compassionate. We need equal share. If I'm going to do this in the home, you're going to need to do this in the home. And, there's some negotiating in there that is, I think, kind of important. But what happened with men is a lot of men lost the plot. So they said, hey, look, if I want to be considered available and attractive to a woman, I'm going to need to play this game. Apparently, this is what's really important right now. So I'll listen, I'll become softer, I'll become empathic, I'll become compassionate. So men moved more towards that model during Aries, Chiron and Aries. That's what men did. They went to Libra as well in their own way, right? And I'm not talking about young men. That's different. I'm talking about men during that time. And I'm not sure men have recovered, by the way, from that period. Because it was almost as if there were a list of unspoken and spoken demands that were taking place as this crosstalk was happening between the sexes. And men began to accede along those lines. And to some degree, I think it was really important. Like if you go back to the 1950s and the 60s and you see some of the advertising for married couples, it's horrific. It's absolutely horrific. Women are completely treated in many of these ads like pieces of furniture or hired help. And some of them are incredibly denigrating, really denigrating. So there had to be an adjustment here. Like we couldn't just keep evolving like that because it was really unbalanced and unconscious. And I'm all for strong and powerful women, and I'm all for strong and powerful men. Okay? I don't think two should happen at the exclusion of the other. So men began to accede. And I'm saying that there was some important things that men needed to wrap their heads around during this period of time. But what happened is that there was never really quite a course correction. There was a bit of a course correction with Robert Bly and the men's movement, but it fizzled out. Now, as we head into Chiron and Aries, what do we have? We have groups like Men Going Their Own Way. And men going their own way are starting their own portal, right? Their own website, their own portal. We have Return of the Kings. And, this is kind of a really hard kind of whiplash towards what's taking place between the evolution or the de-evolution of the sexes. Just before, I guess it's about a year ago, the movie Red Pill came out. And that's when a woman who was a feminist, dyed-in-the-wool feminist, decided she was going to get into the modern day men's movement. And she was expecting to find men who were callous, who were rude, who were cold, brutish, insensitive dicks, right? And what she found was something completely different. What she found was a group of men who were working very, very hard to try to reclaim and regain some dignity in their lives. And she began to see that what's happened to men in the post-sexual revolution has been anything but healthy for men. If you haven't seen Red Pill, highly recommend it. So one of the things we're looking at here with Chiron and Aries is quite possibly the new quote-unquote men's movement. And men aren't always good at creating and organizing. I believe women are much better at creating and organizing. That's just my 2 cents. Okay. So men are going to have to figure out how they're going to do this. Men like to be left alone. They kind of like to be lone wolves. How are men going to organize during this Chiron and Aries time so that they can actually have some semblance of reintegration? And can we even have that dialogue now? Because the way that the free speech game has been set up over the past 2 to 3 years is that any derivation or deviation of speech now is considered hate speech. So can we even have a dialogue, Chiron and Aries? Can the individual express themselves? We have to be able to take that risk with Chiron and Aries. We have to go into that wound about expressing who we are, whether we're men or women. And I think really specifically for men, it's important. And for women with Chiron and Aries, especially if you have Chiron and Aries in your chart, it's about reclaiming that thing that you've been dealing with all your life. There's a small group, I think it's around 1966 to 69, where women both have Saturn and Aries and Chiron and Aries, and that's a tough assignment. It's a very tough assignment. When we get into gender fluidity, we saw some of that with Chiron and Pisces, fluid. Here it's coming into Chiron and Aries. Again, what's a human? Is a human a man, a woman, a he, a she, a z? What is a human? Chiron and Aries. Is a human something that's biological? We've got Uranus in Taurus coming up, and we've got AI now beginning, in a very unspectacular fashion, killing pedestrians in Arizona. AI will make itself known during Chiron and Aries. It'll make itself known. Trust me. It'll make itself known. So we'll have to deal with this notion. What's a human? Right? We have human rights. Will AI have rights? Those are discussions we're going to have. And there are ideas about what it is to be a human, an individual. How much of that are we willing to sacrifice with Chiron and Aries? How much are we willing to let go of what we believe to be our humanity? Will we succumb to things like biometric trafficking biometric tracking? Will we succumb to that? Will we have to deal with that? What about this whole notion of deep biometric tracking? subcutaneous biometric tracking. These are all pieces that we're going to deal with Chiron and Aries, especially in conjunction with Uranus and Taurus, where we're going to have the money change. It's a big deal. It's a really big deal. You know, what else are we going to be dealing with Chiron and Aries? Well, we're going to be dealing with things like football, violence. I'll be very surprised, very, very surprised if at the end of this Chiron and Aries transit, football as we know it will exist. I also think that we're going to start to see a real pushback on sports like boxing and MMA. That's all to look forward to with Chiron and Aries, because we're dealing with things like violence, will, war, the application, physical war, hand-to-hand combat. Speaking of war, what about our wounded warriors? You know, how are we going to deal with them with Chiron and Aries? Can we end our wars? Can this be a time of peace with Chiron and Aries? Are we going to have the war that ends all wars? We thought we did that with World War II. That really wasn't the case now, was it? You know, are we staring down the threats of global war with Chiron and Aries? Will we be brought to the edge of war with Chiron and Aries, only be pulled back during this time? At the precipice, you know, 10 seconds to midnight, where everything's about to go off and all of a sudden we have a kumbaya moment. Is that going to take place? Or we're actually going to have to play this out so we never have another war again? Is that what we're going to experience? It's going to be very interesting, extremely interesting. Because not only will we have Chiron and Aries, but guess what? This is going to last 9 years. Pluto is going to go from Capricorn to Aquarius during this time. We're going to go through the Saturn-Pluto conjunction during this time. We're going to go through Uranus and Taurus during this time. Of course, Jupiter will make a number of passes through signs between now and next 9 years. We'll go through 9 Jupiter cycles during this time. 9 years is a long time, particularly for a Chiron transit. So we're just getting into it, and we're getting into it with the March, and whatever is the fallout after this March that'll take place. I wanted to show you one more thing here before we start to take some questions and answers. It's the last graphic that I have for you, and this will give you some help here. And this is just a basic kind of guide that you can sort of refer to. We'll get into some deeper questions here in a minute. So let me pull up this graphic. Okay, so this is a Chiron through the houses. So this is what you want to pay attention to. All right, wherever Chiron is showing up in your chart, vis-a-vis transit, and it's all about healing. First house, healing self-image, right? Healing self-image, healing your will, okay? Second house, healing your money issues. Very important. Healing your money, safety, security issues. Second house. Third house, it's healing your mind. Healing your mind. Chiron transiting the third, healing your mind. Fourth house, healing your home, healing your relationship with your past, healing your connection with your mother, to some degree your parents, okay? Fifth house, healing your heart, healing your children, or healing with children. So if you're going through a Chiron and Aries, you can go through a crisis around kids, go through a crisis with the heart, you can go through a crisis with this idea of love. Guess what? You get to heal it. Sixth house, healing your work, healing your health. Seventh house, healing relationships, healing one-on-one encounters, individual contracts. Eighth house, healing the shadow. Healing things like not just the shadow, but your past, like your deep past, your genetic past, healing legacies, connecting and healing through death. You may lose a parent with Chiron going through the eighth house and have to deal with their legacy and have to deal with all the crap that comes about it around it, because you know what happens when people pass away. Other people aren't real nice. People get greedy. People get mean. People get nasty. Chiron going through the eighth house, you have to deal with that, heal with that. Ninth house, healing your faith. What do you believe in? What do you aspire towards? You know, where are your spiritual and philosophical goals? Where is life taking you from your perspective of belief system and higher consciousness? You have to heal that. 10th house, healing your career. Is your career worthwhile? Does your career work for you? Does your career feed you? Are you into it? Or do you feel disempowered around your career? Well, guess what? Chiron through your 10th house says you get to focus on it. You get to heal it. In some cases, people have Chiron transiting their 10th house actually become healers. About that. 11th house, healing friendships, healing your relationship with groups, healing your relationship with things like social media. Okay? If you've had a toxic relationship with social media or dating, internet dating, maybe Chiron is telling you to take a break. But it's also healing relationship with friends and groups. If there are friends or groups that you've walked away from, you may revisit them. You may become an inadvertent leader in a group through Chiron. You may have to, if a group is failing, you may be the person that is tasked with actually, healing the group, making sure it stays alive. Or if in some cases, you may be the person that puts it on, you may be the person that pulls the plug on a group, if that's the most healing thing to do. But by and large, there's a responsibility with it. 12th house, healing your soul. That's deep, that's profound. It's healing your relationship with the infinite and the divine. And here's some keywords for you to focus on. Key phrases. Enter the wound. Don't be afraid to enter the wound. Wherever it is, you got to get in there, man. You got to get in there. This Chiron is messy at times. Take radical steps. Take radical steps to address whatever it is you need to take accountability and responsibility for. Be fearless. Aries is fearless. You must summon the courage to deal with the Chirotic crisis or wherever Chiron is in your chart. Release the victim. You are not a victim with Chiron and Aries. You're not a victim. As you release the victim, what happens? You reclaim your will. Reclaiming your will. This is profound. And when I say will is a very complex issue. But I'm talking about mostly where we accede and give our will and power over to others. Then there's a much more complex relationship with the will. That's what I'm talking about. And then to build new structures. Build new structures for your life. This is very important, vitally important with Chiron and Aries. Okay, why don't I stop there and let's open this up for some Q&A. How does that sound, Lotta? Does that sound good?
Great.
Okay. So what do I do now? I go back into that link, right, and open it back up. And do I stop the Google Hang transmission? Is that what I do?
No.
Just turn the volume down?
No, you just have to read what the questions are.
Okay.
I can read them for you if you can't find.
No, let's see it. I'm just waiting for this to pop up. Let's see what we got here. Why don't you go ahead and start reading me some questions?
Okay, guys, if you have questions, there we go.
Okay, what do we have here?
Do you see the question?
I do. I do.
They still haven't started with questions. But...
Okay. What do we have here?
Guys, if you have specific questions.
Mm.
Can you, while we're waiting, if Chiron will be transiting personal planets, to say a few words for that?
Yeah, sure. So when Chiron transits a personal planet, what we're talking about and dealing with is whatever the wound to that planet is. So, for instance, if it's transiting Mercury, it's almost like having Chiron in Gemini, where you have to deal with how you communicate, how you think, how you deal with structuring your thoughts, to some degree, dealing with things like feeling at times crazy, feeling eccentric, feeling sort of misunderstood. And Chiron says the dance with Chiron says you have to claim, you have to be able to claim how that operates in your life, right? You've got to be able to somehow go through this sense that you're not good enough on a mental level, on a communicative level. And Aries ultimately has a lot to do with esteem, right? So it's like getting into your mind, healing your mind, honoring your mind, and being able to use your mind moving forward unapologetically. With the sun, it has to do with the identity, to some degree, like the father, going back to the early relationship with the father in the chart with the Chiron Sun conjunction. So it's about healing and dealing with who you are, the perception of yourself, again, some body image, and a lot of self-acceptance with Chiron conjunct the sun, because obviously it's going to be in Aries. When you get into the Chiron moon conjunction, you're dealing with mother, you're dealing with your emotions, you're dealing with how you feel, femininity, women in your life, right? Again, having the opportunity to heal that. When we're dealing with Chiron conjunct Venus, it's about relationships and looking at relationship in your life. As a relationship in a crutch? Have you been, really engaged in a relationship? And using relationship as something meaningful in your life, or something that hasn't been meaningful? Have you just sort of opted in with a relationship? Have relationships not worked for you? Why haven't they worked for you? Right? Here comes Chiron, and you're being, asked to look at how that's happening. Again, these are all going to be Aries based. We're talking conjunctions. If we're dealing with Chiron and Jupiter, have you squandered opportunity in your life? Because that's what Jupiter brings, is opportunity. Have you squandered it? If you've squandered it, how can you somehow, marshal your forces the next time an opportunity comes into your life? If it's Chiron with Saturn, you're dealing with the father. You're dealing with structures that are bureaucratic. You're dealing with structures that have to do with the government, or anything that's hierarchical. And if you've rebelled against them, you've got to figure out where you are in that niche. If you've been kind of a slave to these structures, then Chiron asks you to look at, well, how do I kind of reclaim again my internal power, my internal guidance? And that's, again, that's going to be that 1966, 1969 period. We're not going to deal with Chiron and Uranus, or Chiron with Neptune, or Chiron with Pluto. So that's not really going to matter. There's going to be oppositions to Chiron. And anytime we're going to be dealing with oppositions, we're going to be dealing with Libra energy. Okay. So again, we're looking at the outside forces, because when we get into opposition, we're dealing with outer forces. So Aries opposite, whatever it is we're dealing with in Libra, whether it's Mercury, Moon, Venus, Jupiter, Saturn, we're dealing with how we've allowed, to some degree, other people or other outside influences designate our choices with who we relate with, how we relate with, and how we share information. So again, it's an opportunity to bring it home, to bring it back into whatever it is that Chiron's opposing. So if it's opposing the moon, you look at your emotional patterning with your mother, and you bring that home and say, okay, well, this is really what, how I'm going to self-nurture moving forward. And these are the types of relationships in Libra that are going to feed that. Or if it's in Venus, it'll be, this is how I'm going to define my relationships. And they're not going to be maybe classically Venusian. They may be something quite different. So if you're used to being attracted to quote unquote really attractive people, then you may revisit that with a Chiron opposition. You may find somebody who's not as classically attractive, but really vibes with you on an energetic level. Or the other hand, if you've been afraid of being with somebody who's really attractive, you may have to kind of reconsider that. Also, in terms of creativity, Chiron can trigger creativity with a Venus opposition. If you're dealing with Chiron in square, and that's going to be the cardinal planets, that's going to be Capricorn, and it's going to be Cancer. Chiron is going to force you to deal, right? So with a conjunction, you're in it. There's no kind of separation or differentiation between the crisis and who you are. With the square, you're having to have some kind of dynamic interactivity with whatever it is it's squaring against, right? So if it's Cancer, Cancer tends to be very different than Aries. Cancer does not move forward. Cancer moves sideways. It moves backwards. Cancer is a reactive sign. Chiron is challenging that. It challenges the Cancerian mode of being. Like, have you retreated too far into your life? Have you retreated too far into your shell? Have you been too engaged in some level of nurturing or bonding that could be, borderline enabling? Have you not allowed people to stand on their own 2 feet, right? Chiron will come in and square that and will challenge you. On the Capricornian side, it will have a similar effect, but Capricorn is the opposite of Cancer. So we're talking about being, detached, cool, sort of calculated, very guided in terms of the path and the direction, always taking that next step up, next step up, next step up. Chiron will cause you, in terms of the square, whatever those planets are, to get you to look at things like ambition. Why are you doing this kind of Capricornian dance in your life? Whatever that planet is. What are you invested in and why are you invested in it? Is your will really aligned with what you're doing? Or is this just something you're doing because your father did it or your mother did it, or it's culturally, ingrained in what you do and who you are? So those squares are dynamic and they're generally a crisis. The square is a crisis, so you have to deal with it. You have to say, oh wow, man, maybe I need to get off this career path. Maybe I've been doing something because it's ingrained, and I've always thought about getting to the next level, next level, next level. Chiron comes in and says, hey, maybe what you're really doing is just forcing something that is unconscious in some ways. So we get into the harmonic angles, and that would be the sextiles to the air planets, with the exception of the opposition to Libra, or the trine to the fire planets. That's when Chiron allows you to really kind of dance and glide with it and gracefully integrate whatever that aspect of Chiron that you're trying to work with is. So it's a graceful kind of application of the will. It's not as difficult. It's like sort of like, oh yeah, I remember what this was like. I'm going to reanimate this, I'm going to integrate it. I'm not going to be afraid of it. Hey, that's easy. This isn't that hard. In fact, I can do this. So it's a gentle kind of encouragement, especially on the sextile side, because the sextile is something you have to activate. A trine can be a reactivation of something from a prior life or a prior existence. So that's how basically Chiron can interact with the other planets.
Thank you. And it sounds like it's a very psychological work that Chiron wants us to do.
I think it is. I think it's deeply psychological because, again, we go back to, especially in Aries, because it's early, right? It's early patterning. It's early patterning. And Chiron is always about early patterning. Generally speaking, it's better because we're dealing with Saturn with Chiron, and we're dealing with the cultural patterns that Saturn begins to indoctrinate us with. So yeah, there's a lot of psychological work that can be done, but there's also really deep work. And I guess if we want to talk about it from a spiritual perspective, Chiron in Aries is about this pure, undifferentiated aspect of will. It's getting us really in touch with the Godhead and life force. It gets us in touch with prana and chi. And when we reconcile that with Chiron, especially in Aries, we could be really potent in terms of our personal expression around it.
Wonderful. Thank you. You can look at the questions now. I think there are.
Yeah, Debbie asks, hi, I have a Chiron at 2.5 Aries, square Mercury. I also have Saturn and North Node in Aries. I never feel I am equipped and brave enough in general. How can I use my Chiron return in Pisces ascendant? Well, that's a really good question. So that means that I'm assuming that all your Aries is happening in your second house. So I would say one of the things because the second house that's the root chakra of the chart. That's the root chakra of the chart. So one of the things you want to do with a Chiron return and all those planets in the second house, you want to face your fear. So what are the things that create a sense of fear or create a sense of insecurity? This is a personal question. Or if you have that second house, similar second house aspect, you want to ask yourself that question. And then basically you want to set out to conquer it. So let's say, for instance, you're afraid of heights. I'll just use that as basic. So one of the things you could do is you could go to a place that does indoor rock climbing, where they set you up on like a series of bands and pulleys, and you could actually learn how to go up a rock face about 20 feet without any real threat of falling. So this is what I would do. Wherever the fear is, wherever your baseline fear is, I would begin to address it. And I would begin to address it in a way that is manageable. Like I wouldn't go gung ho. Although who knows, for some people that might work. Like jumping out of a plane might work. But also the second house has to deal with money and finances too. So, look at where your fear is around money. Maybe you want to get out of that. Maybe you want to be more generous, or to some degree, maybe you want to hold back and be less generous. Whatever that is, I'd say probably more would be better. But face the fear. Face the fear. That's a fundamental place for dealing with the root chakra. It's the root chakra of the chart. Take steps to face that fear and overcome it. You could do it. Saturn brings us the gifts later in life. It's just the nature of it. So really becoming grounded and dealing with things like fear will become much easier for you as Chiron goes through this second house transit. Okay, what else do we have?
I wanted to ask you, what house system do you use? Do we use whole sign house system?
I don't. I use unequal houses, and I like Placidus. Yeah, I like Placidus because, and I know that whole equal houses or whole houses are in vogue, but I like Placidus because there's complexity in Placidus. I like reading for things like intercepted houses, and I think those things are interesting. But that's just me. So that's what I use.
So basically, if we have the second house cusp in Aries towards the 25th degree, we'll only start healing the issues with money we have, say, toward in a few years from now.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, absolutely. Because you're going to be dealing with Taurus in that house, correct?
Mm-hmm.
After that, yeah, absolutely. What else do we have? First Placidus, second whole sign. Okay. But even if you've got those Aries planets happening at the bottom of your first house, it's still worthwhile to begin to push past your limitations with them. But okay, so what do we have here? Valerie says, I am Aqua, Capricorn ascendant, Chiron conjunct Venus, first house. Okay, Pluto also in Leo. How can I use this time to heal and get ahead? Okay, so where is Aries? So Aqua rising. So Aries is going to be what? It's going to be down in the see Capricorn second, Pisces third. So Aries is in your fourth house, right? Correct, right? So you're going to have Aries, Chiron going through your fourth house. Well, that's healing your home number one. And if you're Capricorn ascendant, that means you have Cancer on the descendant. So you're dealing with home, which is Cancer's house, and you're dealing with your seventh house, also, which is Cancer. So you're dealing with, to some degree, the seventh house and clearly the fourth house, because you're dealing with Cancerian issues. So you want to look at, what's the energy like around your home? What was the energy like growing up? What was the energy like with your mother? Was her energy thwarted? Did she not do as much with her life as she could have? Are you going through the same kinds of questions? Then what am I second? I'm looking at Valerie. She says, hold on. She says no second and third houses. Okay, thanks for the clarification, Valerie. So she's dealing with second and third house. So Chiron in the second, again, look at what I was just sharing with before about Chiron in Aries going through the second. If it's through the third, then you're dealing with your mind, and you're dealing with being able to speak your mind, but to speak your mind clearly and to articulate clearly without fear of censure with Uranus in the third house. And if it's the second house essentially is kind of a foundational piece for the third house. If your root chakra is grounded, right, in life in general, isn't it easier to speak your mind? If you're not grounded, try having a conversation when you're not grounded. It's really difficult. So the second house and the third house are linked. So if you can, again, begin to address this root chakra connection, dealing with your foundation, dealing with primary structure, primary principle, and go through that and address some of that, well, guess what? It gets a lot easier to speak and articulate without fear of censure, without fear of being um, shut down. So this is how I see Chiron transiting through the second and third can be very helpful. And if you're dealing with your Aquarius sun, remember that Aquarius Aquarius is exalted. Mercury is exalted in Aquarius, right? And so we're dealing with Mercury issues around the third house. So there'll be some resonance with your identity, which means that you can become a better Aquarian by healing your third house ability to speak and articulate and do so without fear of being censured or truncated or put back in the box. Okay, what else do we have? Not Aries, Sun people.
There is a
Okay.
great question here. Would having a strong Saturnian or Uranian influence in the natal chart impact how one experiences the Chiron return or the wound itself?
So when they say a strong Uranian Saturnian piece, can you clarify that? What is that? Are they in conjunction? Are they trine? What are we talking about here?
They're saying, if, for example, if your Saturn is stronger in the horoscope, or
Mm-hmm.
if Uranus is stronger in the horoscope, will that affect how you experience the?
Oh, I see. I see. Yes and no. I would say I have a strong Saturn in my chart. I have Saturn in Capricorn, right? That's like it's in its own sign. Um, but I have Uranus in the ninth house, and it's actually the second highest planet in my chart. It's in its fall though. It's in Leo. If you have a strong Uranus, well, let's say Uranus is in what? Let's say it would have to be, I don't know. Let's put it Uranus Pluto conjunction, which I think would be a strong Uranus because it'd be amplified by Pluto. I would say that you would have an opportunity to perhaps more gracefully deal with integrating Saturn and Uranus, that it may not be as much of a crisis as, say, other people who would. All right. So you might be able to dance nicely between Saturn and Uranus. You might be able to blend the energies a lot easier. Not, again, astrology is can be fairly specific, but there are also instances where, like, I've talked with people and dealt with people who did not have the chirotic crisis, that they didn't go through that. So how do you explain that? Well, generally speaking, you can kind of look at it and say, well, look, they had a nice sextile to Uranus in their chart, or they had a nice wide conjunction with Chiron in their chart. So not everybody has to go through that Saturn Uranian piece, but I would say most of us do, because this is how life is wired on Earth. We're either engaged in form and the creation of form, or the destruction of form and the creation of something new out of that form. That's how generally what we're involved in most of the time. In some cases, you'll see people, like, if you look at somebody like Steven Spielberg, you don't look at Steven Spielberg's career and life path. He's an Aquarian, by the way, as one being like form, destruction, form. There's another filmmaker, Brian De Palma, who has had a period like that, or Francis Coppola has had periods like that. So Spielberg, I would say, without even looking at his chart, probably has a nice relationship between Saturn and Uranus in his chart. I'm going to go on record and say that's probably the case. So in terms of resolving that, I think it would be in some ways easier and more fluid and more integrative. Although I would say that at some point you would go through some kind of challenge, because you're always going to have, at some point in time, a planet, either an inner planet, strong inner planet like Mars, or one of the outer planets in square with one of those two planets. So that's my answer to that. I hope that that's what they were looking for. Chiron will transit my sixth house, opposing my Chiron. Okay, so you're in Chiron opposition. Jupiter in the middle and Neptune earlier, 5 degree. What should you look for? So Chiron's transiting your sixth house, opposing Chiron. So you have Chiron in your 12th. Well, that could be a spiritual and physical healing crisis. And that could manifest in a couple of different ways. So let's say, for instance, and I know who this is. So let's say, for instance, you have done certain things in a certain way in terms of your healing. And all of a sudden, let's say, for instance, you've really been into probiotics. All right, you've really been huge probiotic person, and all of a sudden you find out probiotics aren't great for you. And you've created like this paradigm on probiotics, and all of a sudden you've got this crisis, right? And I'm just using one kind of version of it, because on the other end of it, with Chiron in the 12th house, you're dealing with something that's very deep, very kind of profound, very, very kind of personal, transpersonal. And what it does is it questions. You have to question something at a soul level where you have a Chiron opposition going on. At least in this instance, with Chiron in Aries opposing Chiron in Libra. That's one version of it. Another version of it is that Chiron in opposition can reanimate Chiron in Libra, and it may challenge you to take a risk with relationship. And that relationship may be connected to somebody that you work with, or you have some kind of dharmic path with in the sixth house. That could be another manifestation of this. But it represents having to reconcile something that's new and coming in, and can be to some degree disturbing, challenging a deeper seated pattern, connection, relationship that you have sort of locked and tucked away at a deep level and have to open back up and then re-examine it and bring it into that sixth house piece. Does that make sense? I hope it makes sense. That's what I would look for. I think it's an opening, but it's an opening that takes place and reanimates a much deeper part of your chart. Soul reanimation. Okay, what do we have here? Natal square in Taurus in 12th in the 5th degree, don't remember. Trine Moon and Saturn in my 4th, okay. And then 5th house, Virgo 5th house cusp, but not in trine, and Venus in 8th. How to heal when don't remember and use trines. Gemini on the ascendant. So this is interesting. So you have Taurus in the 12th. Let's see, Taurus in 12th, 5th degree. What are we talking about? Chiron in Taurus? Is that what they're saying? Is that right?
Yes, I think so.
Well,
Chiron Taurus in the 12.
Yeah, so guess what's
coming?
Yeah, guess what's coming to town? Uranus. Uranus is coming to town. So you're going to have Uranus conjuncting your natal Chiron. So you don't remember? Well, get ready, because you will remember with Uranus conjuncting Chiron, and it will come to you through dreams. Whatever it is you didn't remember, it'll come to you through dreams. It can come to you through things like watching a movie, and all of a sudden that movie triggering something deep inside of you. You know, Uranus transiting the 12th house can be pretty transcendental, and at times, I would say shocking on a spiritual level. So if you don't remember, don't worry, because I guarantee you when Chiron is cozying up to Uranus in your 12th house, you'll remember. You'll remember. Things will come to you. Will come to you through dreams and the externalization of some kind of hidden memory, some kind of hidden piece to your life. Like Chiron in Taurus in the 12th house is, why did you come here? Why did you come here? Why did you take up a body? It's buried. It's like your time capsule is buried. Okay. Don't 5th degree, don't remember childhood. Yeah. Yeah. So I would say have patience. Change is coming to that part of your life. But good, yeah, it's like a time capsule that's opened up. And I think that opening, like your mission will become known to you over the course of the next 2 years. And it'll be very, very interesting. You can do past life regression. If you find a person that's good at it, you can do past life regression with Uranus going through the 12th house. And that could actually bring you some interesting information. Hypnosis can bring you some interesting. I had a really powerful hypnosis session back when I was, let's see, in my 30s, and Pluto was going through my 12th house. It was very profound. Sometimes Akashic readings can bring some interesting insight and clarity, though I don't know who does good Akashic readings anymore. Just wait for Uranus. It'll cost you less. Okay, what do we have here? My AC is in Libra and Sun, Saturn in Aries, 6th house. Okay, so this is a person that was born between 1966 and 1969. I'm looking at Gaudi Tech. Is that right? You're born between 66 and 69, correct? Okay, so if you're born between 66 and 69, and you've got Saturn and Aries in the 6th house, that could be a real struggle around health with Saturn and Aries and vitality, because Aries is vital. And Saturn's in its fall in Aries, right? It's exalted in Libra. So it's in its fall. So Chiron coming into your 6th house is basically saying, I'm sick and tired of this shit. That's what it's saying. I am sick and tired. And you're going to do anything that it takes to do 2 things. Number 1, get healthy. And number 2, find your purpose. Anything. So I would say, look at things like if you have Libra ascending, That means that I would try to go more into Mars and more into Aries, because Libra ascending is ruled by Venus. So you want to apply more Mars in your chart. Look at things like martial arts. Look at things like dealing with your blood, tonifying your endocrine system. Anything that's connected with blood purification. This would be really, really important. The reclamation of purpose and will, again, by any means necessary. Any means necessary. Okay? All right. Thank you. You're welcome. Lori says that she has natal Chiron at 29 Aquarius. Can you tell me about Chiron transit in Aries in the eighth house? I talked a little bit about that before. So you're at the anaretic degree of Chiron in Aquarius. You couldn't get out of it. You had to represent Atlantis in this lifetime. So Chiron going through the eighth house is you're dealing with things like, well, you're dealing with legacies, but you're also dealing with your shadow. You're dealing with your shadow. What house? Eighth house. Do you have Aries there in your eighth house? That's really interesting. A lot of that, that's very sexual. Aries in the eighth house is it's Mars in the eighth house is like Mars in Scorpio. Aries in the eighth house is it's very sexual. So you're dealing with sexual energy, you're dealing with ki, you're dealing with life force. So Chiron and Aries to me through that house is sexual healing. And how you can, so I would get into things like I'd get into things like tantra, or I get into things like, how you can connect creative healing and ki with sexual healing, sexual energy, and maybe, and exploring vulnerability through that. I would look at it from that perspective and reclaiming your sexual energy on some level, whatever that is, or however that manifests. So if you're in a relationship or a marriage and your sex has become perfunctory, I would reinvest in it. I would look at doing things like a tantric workshop or something like that with your partner. Even if you're not married, if you're in a relationship, I would look at that. If you're single, and you're looking to connect with another person, it's about dealing with your vulnerability around sexuality and, like, how much intensity and how much pleasure would you be open to with Chiron and Aries going through the eighth house. And when it's in Aries, I mean, that's powerful. That's powerful, masculine energy. So that's one version of it. Another version, of course, is when we get into the eighth house, we're dealing with the power of intention, because the second house is about manifestation of material resources. And the eighth house is all about magnetism. Magnetism. Square your Mars. So what should you focus on with squaring your Mars? Let me finish this off when we get into it. So Chiron and Aries can help you deal with things that are like taboo, right? Because the eighth house is taboo. And it's about, well, let's say I want to use my individual will to bring things into my life. Well, that's been a taboo. We don't do that. I came from a church that didn't do that, or I came from a background that didn't do that. That's another version of Chiron going through Aries in the eighth house. So it's about energy, 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 energy. Okay. Let's see. Peace of mind and spirit. Chiron and Aries will transit my eighth house and will eventually square my Mars in Capricorn in the fifth at 12 degrees. That's a ways off. You're looking at about 5 years from now, 4 to 5 years from now. But what you could be dealing with, you've got Mars and Capricorn in the fifth. I think that unlocks your Mars. That's what it feels like to me. It feels like it unlocks your Mars, because Saturn in the fifth house is not a great place for Saturn. You know, that's like Leo's house, and it's childhood and its expression and its novelty and its fun and its pleasure and love affairs and gambling. You know, it's fire. And Saturn, you know, Saturn brings, you know, Saturn is not great for fire. Saturn's an, you know, it's an Earth planet. So when we get into Saturn in the fifth house, these are people that probably didn't have much of a childhood, you know, or their child in their childhood they had to be like a second or third parent, you know. With Mars there, it's like not being able to express, not being able to express. Am I right? Mars. Let me see. Mars in Capricorn. Okay, so it's Mars. That's Mars in the fifth house. It's not bad. That's better, but it's still in Capricorn, and it's still engaged in some kind of Capricornian duty. So again, we're looking at the Chiron square, which challenges you to recreate your Mars. Like, what do you do for pleasure? What do you do for fun? You know, what do you do for excitement? Again, you know, that's energy. What do you do for sex, sexuality, connecting sexuality with love and romance and the heart? I mean, again, Chiron could be an opening with the square. It's not a it's not for a while. Also, that's the house of children, and a Chiron Mars square can deal with both the potential conflict and hopefully resolution in terms of dealing with children. I would say it's about reanimating things that you loved at one point in time. That's how I feel about that Chiron square to Mars. Yeah, Mars and Capricorn is not too bad. Not it's much better than Saturn. I'm sorry, I thought it was Saturn. I apologize. Been talking for a while. Um, Peace of Mind says also Saturn and Jupiter and Libra squared that Mars. Oh, well then, of course, you've got a Saturn square to Mars. Yes, absolutely. So we're talking a grand trine here. And a grand trine, it's actually a T square. My apologies. That's a T square. And a T square could be a major crisis, but it's not. When I say major crisis, I don't. It's not about doom and gloom. When you get into T squares, you can clear up a lot of things. You can clear them up quickly, both in this lifetime and in terms of your relationship with all your variations of selves. You know, going down the timeline from this self to prior selves to even future selves. So T squares in transit can be very productive. But I would have to say that Chiron would shake things up and bring things out of that eighth house that would cause you to really revisit how you use your energy and how your energy vis-a-vis the Saturn square to Mars have been censored over time. Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that. And even in certain relationships with Saturn and Libra, even if they're good ones, it would be like, you know, there are rules of engagement and not necessarily bad ones. Chiron going through the eighth house would be redefining what those rules of engagement are. Could be very interesting. If you're in a relationship, it may be a crisis in a relationship too. Let's see. Da-da-da-dum. Chiron and Aries will transit my eighth house. Okay, we got into that. And Bailey asks, what will impact of Saturn and Capricorn square Chiron and Aries? Is that in general in the world? Is that are we talking in the world? Are we talking about in your chart? Saturn. So you can come back and answer that question. Leany one says, okay, what's mine? Chiron in Aquarius 10th. 13% at 13 degrees, I think she's saying. And Aries in my 12th with South Node, 14 degrees. So what you have here is you have a Chiron Aries sextile, which is interesting. So you have Chiron and so you're going to South Node is there too. Yeah, that's really interesting. You know, that's like, you know, they talk about Mars in the 12th house as being hidden enemies back in the old days of astrology, and there's some merit to that. So Aries in the 12th house, I'm sorry, Chiron in Aries in the 12th house is somewhat similar because it's that Martian / Martial energy. And the South Node there, conjunct Chiron, it almost feels like there's this sense of being haunted, haunted for something you haven't done in this lifetime. That's what it feels like. Feels like you're being haunted. It's like some degree of, I would say, maybe, I wouldn't say paranoia, maybe guilt, some degree of fear, like an existential fear, because there's something that took place. It's some other place in time, because South Node is past life. It almost feels like, a classic case of like having killed somebody in a past life, taking somebody's life. That's what it feels like. So the Chiron transit allows you to heal that, and face some very deep fears. I mean, there's really only one source of fear, and that's death. And we leave the 12th house. We come into the chart via the ascendant, and we leave the 12th house. We leave the chart and our life via the 12th house. So when you've got South Node and Chiron there in the 12th house, it's definitely past life, prior incarnation. So that's what I would look at. You get to face these kinds of existential fears, and they can manifest themselves in nightmares. You can have violent dreams, but you get to face them. You get to work it out in the dream life. You get to look at how your fears, your deep-seated fears, interpenetrate the rest of your chart and the rest of your life. That's spiritual healing. I would really do a lot of meditation and prayer and cleansing, and really look for some degree of forgiveness and self-forgiveness. And Chiron will bring it up. And ultimately, you'll get to a place where you'll realize that there was never anything really to fear in the first place. But that's a process. It's a very deep one, by the way. I hope that helps, Lenny or Leni.
Thank you so much, Robert.
Yeah.
It's an amazing webinar.
Good. I hope people liked it. I mean, it seems like we had more people during the Capricorn, Saturn and Capricorn one, but that's okay. Maybe Chiron is kind of a minor subject and people aren't that interested. I think it's really important.
Most people watch it after that.
Okay.
Good. A lot of people wrote to me that they can't attend live, so maybe.
Yeah. Okay.
More people that couldn't.
Well, good. Well, listen, it's been a real pleasure working with all of you today, and I love talking about Chiron. And I know that I tend to go out there a little bit at times, but I try to reel it back in. And this is a really fantastic time for everybody to begin to face their fears and, take what I would call reasonable, calculated risk to reclaim wherever Chiron is shown up in your chart. Okay?
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And on that positive note, everyone has a fantastic day. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you very much, Lotta.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.